The smallest star. The picture illustrates the relative size compared to the Sun and Jupiter of a recently discovered star, the smallest ever detected. Called OGLE TR122b, it has a ring to it. It is observed to cross in front of a Sun-like companion about once every 7 days. The description of Ogle TR122b is enigmatic, though it is only 16% larger than the gas giant Jupiter. Astronomers say that it is 96 times as massive. Astronomers describe the smallest star as a core-burning star, like our Sun. But prevailing theory never anticipated such a diminutive star. Since a standard fusion model of stars required a minimum gravitating mass considerably greater than that of Jupiter to account for the highly anomalous object, and in particular the induced wobble in the motion of its larger companion, astronomers simply accepted what their model implied. While Ogle TR122b is only 16% larger than Jupiter, it must contain 96 times the mass of Jupiter and 50 times the density of the Sun. Investigative team member astronomer Claudio Mello of the European Southern Observatory in Santiago, Chile, summarizes the achievement of the small star this way. Imagine that you add 95 times its own mass to Jupiter, and nevertheless end up with a star that is only slightly larger. The object just shrinks to make room for the additional matter, becoming more and more dense. But this hypothesized feat of shrinking or supercondensing matter is merely hypothetical. Nothing of the sort has ever been achieved in laboratory experiments, and no one has ever observed such a thing anywhere in the natural world. Were the feat not required to save a theory, astronomers would have surely called it a violation of the self-evident laws of physics. Another viewpoint is now well established. They're like, it's too hard to change the paradigm. Besides, the textbook lobby in Washington is one of the nation's most powerful. However, in this view, the calculations of the mass of this dwarf star are highly inflated. They do not take into account the strong electromagnetic forces between the small star and its larger parent star, nor does it factor in our profound ignorance of the nature of mass and gravity and its relationship to the electrical structure of matter. In the electric universe model, gravitational distortion of atoms within a star gives rise to atomic electric dipoles that align to form a radial internal electric field. The electric field produces charge separation within a star on a scale that not only prevents further compression but also causes splitting or perturbation of a star and a nova outburst if it becomes electrically or gravitationally destabilized. The standard stellar model, however, relies on the interior of stars obeying the perfect gas laws, which allows astrophysics to dismiss internal charge separation, as Eddington did in his seminal work, The Internal Constitution of the Stars. The result of electrical splitting is two energetic bodies of unequal size, a Sun-like star and a smaller, close-orbiting binary partner. As we see in this example, the electric birth of the companion star or gas giant will place it much closer to its parent than traditional gravity-based models had ever envisioned or even considered possible. OGLE TR122b is not a super-dense companion, but it is merely a subject to stronger electromagnetic interaction with its parent star. But it is merely subject to stronger electromagnetic interaction within its parent star, due to the nature of its birth. Where the electric force is active in this way, Newtonian calculations of mass and density will always produce bizarre results. Electrically, the standard threshold mass for a star is a meaningless concept. Electrically, the standard threshold mass for a star is a meaningless concept. Stars do not have to ignite a fusion reaction in their core to produce their energy. They receive electrical power directly from the cosmic Birkeland currents that thread the galaxy, and the nuclear reactions occur, not in the core, but at the bright photosphere of a star. This is a testable claim if astronomers will ask the question. Unfortunately, when orthodox theorists confront the failure of Newtonian concepts, they often turn first to panaceas.
Parturition. Panacea.
Proposing mere abstractions such as dark matter or supercondensed degenerate matter to save their theory. To the cosmic electricians, these computer games have no relationship to the verifiable dynamics of the natural world. It's dated March 8, 2005, from Thunderbolts. A mainstream scientist, physicist, educator, and author has come clean and admits Saturn was once a star. Her name is Dr. Claudia Albers. Well, 2 years ago now, this is the first I've heard of it, though, Monday, May 13th, 2019. Saturn was once a star. Dr. Claudia Albers, Planet X researcher. Thank you very much. As I have shown in Article 621, gas giant vindication and why Dr. Eugene Schumacher was really killed, all known for gas giants in the solar system, were once Planet X stellar cores, SC. Earth, each was a central SC of a Planet X SC system. These systems were comprised of the core system that was once inside a star or a planet and the debris pieces which had once constituted the body material of the object. When stars become energy depleted, the material that made up the body of the stars and that had been created by the cores broke into pieces, and the cores were released from inside the body of the star. They became a jumbled mess of cores surrounded by debris field. Figure 1 here is a beautiful picture of Saturn. It's 9 times larger than the Earth, and like Jupiter, it was a large central core of what was once a star. Planets will tend to be about the same size as the Earth, and thus have a core system with a central core. Now, that would be smaller than the Earth. Now, that is something that really caught my attention because I have always thought that somehow all of the cores in the solar system of the sun's surface with the cores of all the planets. I mean, how else would they stay hot? They have to continuously be going through this effect or it would cool down. I'm sure the Earth's rotation probably helps too, but it has to be connected to something extraterrestrial. And when they're a safe distance away, it's not as volatile. It doesn't take billions of years to cool down. The sun and the core of the Earth are the same temperature, which is a big indicator that they're connected via Birkeland currents. In fact, this picture right here can be looked at like the sun's Birkeland current to Earth. Is that what we're looking at here? Or is that just some kind of a mirage? Anyways, get back to it here. Figure 2, a star's core breaks into one larger core surrounded by satellite cores. Some of the satellite cores are ejected outside of the body of the star and turn into new planets. See Article 785, Planet X is here, but what is it exactly? Just by looking into the umbra of a sunspot, it's contradictory to the fusion core model. And you'll see the only true black hole in the universe, the umbra of the sunspot. If the sun had nuclear reactions going on in the core, then it would be blindingly bright, not black. I think, what was that saying? Yes, the fusion assumption has never been authenticated. And one other thing that I would say is, what does she think the energy is when she says the energy? It's electricity. It's the only thing it can be. The only force in the universe. That's what they suppress. She's on the right track, but she's using the wrong model. Cores of stars are cool. That's why they're black. Unless they have some new epicycle to enter, when something is hotter, it's brighter, and the core would be brighter in sunspots, not a black hole, basically. It's the only real black hole that exists in the universe. A sunspot. The umbra. How can nuclear fusion be black? It can't. Interesting.
They're unnecessary. Venus is a baby. Since my predictions were written in 2004, the electrogravity model has been further developed, and it explains electrogravitational capture and the rounding of cometary orbits by electrical discharge. It explains the huge capture cross-section of stars and why the observed phenomenal discharging of cometary Venus caused it to finally have the most circular orbit of any planet. The electric universe conceptual model can claim a number of successful predictions. Significantly, it was the only model to predict the surface features of smog-shrouded Titan before the Huygens probe revealed them in detail. Titan, which is 50% larger than our Moon, is an enigma for astronomers, having a global orange haze that has prevented us from seeing surface features. It has a massive atmosphere, mainly of nitrogen, with a pressure at the surface like that at the bottom of a swimming pool. The atmosphere also contains methane and at least 9 other organic molecules. The methane is being continually destroyed by solar radiation, which raises a further problem about its source of resupply if the Moon is 4.6 billion years old. This has led to widespread speculations of Titan possibly being covered by an approximately 1 kilometre deep ocean of liquid ethane. However, radar, infrared and radio observations of Titan have not found signs of a hydrocarbon ocean. In fact, one radar return was of a type that we would expect to get back from Venus. But Titan is not 4.6 billion years old, and the Earth did not form where we find it today. Instead, Saturn's largest moon, Titan, is a child of Saturn and a sibling of Venus, Earth and Mars. I wrote just before Cassini arrived at Saturn, we should be alert to similarities between Titan and Venus. On November 29, 2006, the Dallas Morning News reported, when the $3 billion Cassini spacecraft sailed past Titan 3 weeks ago, it was supposed to clear up many of the mysteries about Saturn's largest moon. Instead, it has left scientists more befuddled. The new Cassini images do not support previous theories about Saturn's moon. In New Scientist of November 6, 2004, Titan images add to Moon's mystery, Stephen Battersby reported. The world got its first peek at the surface of Saturn's moon Titan last week. The images were taken as NASA's Cassini-Huygens spacecraft swept past the moon. The images show a landscape that is clearly still being shaped. Although Titan must have suffered numerous meteor impacts in the past, its surface today is largely crater-free. Somehow these scars must have been eroded or filled in. We are seeing a place that is alive, geologically speaking, says Charles Ilachi, head of the team running Cassini's radar instrument. I commented at the time, that is precisely what was said about Venus when the Magellan orbiter revealed that planet's surface. It is only supposition that Titan's surface is still being shaped. It's based on the belief that Titan must have suffered numerous meteor impacts in the past, and therefore something must have occurred from within the moon to fill the craters. However, like Venus, there may have been no impact craters to fill. For that matter, no one has witnessed a large crater-forming meteor impact. The report continued, suggestions of an active dynamic surface on Titan are beginning to emerge. Not a single crater has been identified yet, which means the surface must be young and active. One large circular feature, suspected of being a crater until closer examination showed it to be flat, closely resembles the pancake domes seen on Venus that are produced by magma welling up to produce a bubble that then slumps down to a nearly flat profile. Other features resemble the lobes of some surface lava flows. We don't understand what we're looking at. Titan is going to be a real challenge. My comment was, the surprise about the lack of craters and Titan's apparent active dynamic surface mirrors the comments made about Venus when radar images were first returned. The large, flat, circular feature on Titan does resemble the pancake dome seen on Venus. However, these domes were not formed by volcanic circularity in just one of these domes. The surface must be absolutely horizontal and the flow from the central vent must be perfectly even in all horizontal directions. But there are many domes on Venus. In the electric universe model, the domes are more simply explained as the raised blisters sometimes caused by lightning. Small-scale circular raised blisters have been found following a negative cloud-to-ground lightning strike to a lightning conductor cap. They're called fulgurites. A test of this hypothesis would be to determine if the surface around these domes is sunken. Fulgurites show this characteristic borrow pit effect where the material has been drawn inwards and upwards by the intense discharge to form the raised blister. It is not something to be expected from a volcanic upwelling. Inexplicably, in terms of the volcanic model, where two domes overlap, the relief of the underlying dome doesn't disturb the overriding dome. This, and the chain formation seen above, is typical of electrical scarring in general, where one crater is often centered on the rim of another, with little disturbance of the existing crater. With fulgurites, one mound often occurs on top of another as a result of multiple strokes within the lightning flash. So it seems that the images of Titan's surface returned by Cassini so far are predictable based on forensic evidence that we should be alert to similarities between Titan and Venus. This brings us to the other major puzzle about Titan, its atmosphere. Titan's atmosphere is believed by many scientists to be similar to Earth's early atmosphere, billions of years ago. Toby Owens, principal scientist at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, said, "What we've got is a very primitive atmosphere that has been preserved for 4.6 billion years. Titan gives us the chance for cosmic time travel, going back to the very earliest days of Earth when it had a similar atmosphere." From New Scientist, November 6, Titan appears to have lost much of its original atmosphere. The Moon has an unusually high abundance of nitrogen-15 compared with the lighter isotope nitrogen-14. That could be explained if most of the atmosphere had evaporated into space, a process in which the nitrogen-14 would have escaped more easily than nitrogen-15. What could cause such a loss is unknown, but it would mean that Titan once had an atmosphere 40 times as thick as Earth's, making it a dwarf version of a gas planet. This bizarre world may be far more complex than we have begun to imagine, says Larry Soderblom of the U.S. Geological Survey in Flagstaff, Arizona. My comment was, Titan's atmosphere is primitive, but not in the sense that it remains 4.6 billion years old. Instead, there has not been time for young Titan to lose much atmosphere. If Titan, like Venus, is a young, recently ejected body, it may still be cooling from its natal heat, and, like Venus, it has a super-rotating wind. The striking disparity in nitrogen isotopes is telling us something about the way planetary atmospheres are formed, rather than how they evolve. There are several processes during birth in an electrical discharge that will have significant effects on planetary atmospheres, including that of Titan. The primary effect comes from the source and depth of the ejection from the flaring parent dwarf star or gas giant. The chemical elements in the discharge are then sorted according to their critical ionization velocity. Also, isotopes will tend to separate in the magnetic field of the plasma discharge. Lastly, the plasma gun effect, seen now ejecting material from Io's so-called volcanoes into space, is known in the laboratory to be a copious source of neutrons. The neutrons may be captured to form heavy isotopes and radioactive elements. The variable combination of all these effects suggests that it would be unlikely for any two bodies in the same family to have identical initial atmospheres. Subsequent electrical interactions between planets and moons would also serve to transfer surface materials and atmospheres, transmute elements, and further complicate the picture. That fits generally with the irregular elemental and isotopic signatures found in the atmospheres of our planetary system. For example, nitrogen in lunar soils is 10 times more abundant than one may expect from the concentrations of solar wind rare gases. There are some other mechanisms that could also contribute to the lack of nitrogen-14 in Titan's atmosphere. For example, nitrogen-14 can capture an electron to become carbon-14. Carbon-14 decays by very weak beta decay back to nitrogen-14 with a half-life of approximately 5,730 years. If the age of Titan's atmosphere can be measured in tens or hundreds of thousands of years instead of billions, then a significant amount of nitrogen-14 may still be locked up as carbon-14, contributing perhaps to the hydrocarbons in Titan's atmosphere and on its surface. To suggest Titan once had an atmosphere 40 times as thick as Earth's, making it a dwarf version of a gas planet, only complicates the plainly impossible standard model of formation of the solar system. Why don't other large moons in the outer solar system have substantial residual atmospheres? It seems far more plausible to suggest that Titan is a much newer moon than Jupiter's Ganymede or Callisto. Titan simply hasn't had time to lose its heavy atmosphere, just as Saturn hasn't had time to lose its rings following its last discharge. In this picture, we now have the key to understanding what shapes Titan's landscape, said Dr. Martin Tomasco, principal investigator for the Descent Imager Spectral Radiometer, adding, "Geological evidence for precipitation, erosion, mechanical abrasion, and other fluvial activity says that the physical processes shaping Titan are much the same as those shaping Earth." These comments demonstrate the problem of interpretation when the model is geocentric. Methane is a non-polar molecule which doesn't form clouds and rain like electrically polarized water molecules do. So precipitation, erosion, and other fluvial activity will not occur, much the same as those shaping Earth. Finally, returning to Venus, why is its atmosphere so different to the other planets and Titan? The atmosphere of Venus is mostly carbon dioxide, 96.5% by volume. Most of the remaining 3.5% is nitrogen. This inhospitable mix is accompanied by clouds of sulfuric acid. I explained in my 2004 article, Venus probably began with an atmosphere more like Titan's and the Earth's, where nitrogen dominates and with more water. On the Venusian surface, nitrogen molecules require very little energy to transmute to carbon monoxide molecules by a catalytic surface nuclear reaction in the presence of red-hot iron. The brilliant French chemist Louis Couvrin, when investigating carbon monoxide poisoning of welders, discovered this surprising transmutation. The carbon monoxide then reacts at the hot surface of Venus with water vapour to form carbon dioxide and hydrogen, in a well-known industrial process. The hydrogen produced escapes from Venus. This process explains the puzzling discovery made by Venus landers that the water vapour concentration diminished as they approached the Venusian surface. But decisively, it explains the heavy carbon dioxide atmosphere and little remaining nitrogen on Venus. It also explains the steady stream of hydrogen escaping from the top of Venus's atmosphere at present and the phenomenally high proportion, 120 times that on Earth, of heavy hydrogen or deuterium left behind in its atmosphere. What I've attempted to show here is a coherent story using forensic evidence stretching back into prehistory of celestial events involving planets and their electrical thunderbolt interactions. A new picture of the universe results from paying heed to Alfvén's warning to introduce electric universe science into cosmology. This is a fundamental shift from the ad hoc theoretical approach, which has no theory explaining the force of gravity, and so, unsurprisingly, no success trying to introduce order into a chaos of anomalies. It has no chance of ever discovering that we are children of the planet and former brown dwarf star, Saturn. This is an invitation to the greatest adventure, to begin to understand our real history and place in the universe for the first time, and that must bring about a much-needed cultural change that may dwarf the scientific revolution. That change is essential if we are to have a future, because the post-traumatic stress disorder we have inherited threatens our very existence on this planet. It manifests as a desire not to know the shocking truth because it exposes our existential fears. As Roger Westcott ably expressed it, man is a wounded animal. His survival is astonishing, but his inability to heal his wounds is tragic. It is tragic because, as Velikovsky argued, being descendants of the survivors of great paroxysms of nature of the past, we are possessed by the urge inherited through racial memory to repeat the violent performance. And it was his greatest fear that we now had the destructive capability to produce our own doomsday. Along with that genius Carl Jung, he warned that mankind is his own worst enemy. So the cultural change offered by electric universe cosmology is essential for our survival. By offering a real understanding of the universe and our history, it offers hope and inspiration where presently there is none. There is far more to life in the electric universe than is dreamt of presently. We are all intimately connected with each other and the Earth. Enjoy the Saturnian Festival of Lights and the New Year.
Amen. Yeah, that's an important message. It really is, because if you look at society today, we are wounded. We really don't want to know the truth. That's why there's the official story, and then there's what happened, and it exists in pretty much every realm. I don't know why. They must think that we're primitives and will fall apart at the first sound of any kind of news that isn't jolly or something. I don't know. I'm up in the Great Hall, folk, guys, for those of you interested. I'm gonna play a song and I'm on a thought train here, and I gotta find it, so it's gonna take me about maybe 30 seconds to a minute. So I'm just gonna put this on, and when I find it, it'll come off. Okay. Saturn's Golden Age. The age that man later called the Age of Kronos is remembered with nostalgia as an age of bliss. References to the Age of Kronos in ancient lore are very numerous. Hesiod tells of a golden race of mortal men who lived in the time of Kronos when he was reigning in heaven, and they lived like gods without sorrow of heart, remote and free from toil. Miserable age rested not on them. The fruitful earth unforced bare them fruit abundantly and without stint. They dwelt in ease and peace upon their lands with many good things. Similarly, writes Ovid in the 6th book of his Metamorphoses, in the beginning was the Golden Age, when men of their own accord, without threat of punishment, without laws, maintained good faith, and did what was right. The earth itself without compulsion, untouched by the hoe, unfurrowed by any share, produced all things spontaneously. It was a season of everlasting spring. Rabbinical sources recount that men lived under very favorable conditions before the deluge, and that these contributed to their sinfulness. They knew neither toil nor care, and as a consequence of their extraordinary prosperity, they grew insolent. The dominance of Saturn at some remote period in the history of life of the peoples on Earth was of such pronounced and all-pervading character that the question arises whether the adventures of the planet going through many exploits could by itself be the full cause of the worship of the planet and the naming of the Golden Age, the Age of Kronos, Saturn. Saturn exploded and caused the Earth to go through the greatest of its historical catastrophes, and this was completely sufficient to make of Saturn the supreme deity. But it appears that the age of Saturn is a name for the epoch before the deluge. After the deluge, Saturn, dismembered, almost ceased to exist as a planetary body, and when at length it was reconstituted, it was fettered by rings, and was far from being the dominant celestial body that would behoove it as the supreme deity of the epoch. The age of Kronos is so glorious an age that it is hardly thinkable to connect it with the period after the deluge. The wailing for Adonis, Tammuz of the Babylonians, or Osiris of the Egyptians, deplored the end of its dominance, not the beginning of it. Then why was Saturn the supreme deity by whose name the great and glorious age before the deluge was named? Because it removed Uranus from its role of chief deity, and to the onlookers on Earth emasculated him. If the distances between the Earth and Saturn and Uranus were then what they are now, then such occurrences could scarcely be observable. Uranus is only faintly visible in the night sky over Mesopotamia in a most translucent night. Saturn is clearly visible, but is not, for an unaided eye, a spectacle in the sky. It was more voluminous and more luminous before the deluge, but if it moved on an orbit not too different from the present one, and Earth were moving approximately in the same quarters where it moves today, then the surprise still persists as how a body on a 30-year-long orbit could make the inhabitants of the Earth on its 1-year-long orbit regard it as the supreme of all celestial bodies in the sky. The appellative sun employed for Saturn could be explained by its unusual brightness when it exploded as a nova for a short time, actually for 7 days before the beginning of the deluge on Earth, assuming the length of the day in those times to have been not too dissimilar from its present value, the velocity of the moving masses being in the order of 100 kilometers a second, or 8,600,000 kilometers in a 24-hour period, and the Earth and Saturn being on the closest points of their reciprocal orbits, or in conjunction, which is another surmise. In 7 days, a distance of circa 60 million kilometers would be covered. On present orbits, the distance between Saturn and Earth varies from 1,279 million kilometers at superior conjunction and 1,578 million kilometers at opposition. The lesser of these distances is circa 21 times greater than that above calculated. This means also that unless the velocity of the ejected water was an order of magnitude greater than 100 kilometers per second
The distance between Saturn and Earth must have been substantially smaller than it is at present. I have rather arbitrarily selected a figure of 100 kilometers a second for the motion of the exploded material. Today, the escape velocity, or the speed required for a projectile on the surface of Saturn to leave the gravitational attraction of the planet, is but 35 kilometers a second. For Jupiter, the escape velocity is 59 kilometers a second. Assuming that Saturn was a mass equal to that of Jupiter, the same figure would apply to it too. With 100 kilometers a second, we have almost double the velocity of escape. The arbitrariness of the assumption of such velocity for our calculations is obvious, but if the set of figures is not too far from what they actually were, the conclusion would be that of Earth from Saturn was but a 20th part of what it is now. This would permit us to speculate whether Earth could, at some early period, have been a satellite of Saturn. The distance, 60 million kilometers, is commensurate with the distance of Mercury from the Sun, or 58 million kilometers. Jupiter's satellites revolve at distances up to 24 million kilometers from the primary. Theoretically, Saturn could have satellites as large as the Earth. The Moon is only 1/40th of the Earth in volume, whereas Saturn is 760 times larger than our planet. If such was ever the case, the age of Saturn, and the very unusual conditions under which mankind lived in it, and Saturn's worship prior to the deluge, would gain in meaning. The appellative sun used for Saturn would be understood as resulting not only from the great light it emitted for a short period when a nova, but also from its long-standing role of a primary for the revolving Earth. If there is truth in the surmise, and nothing more it is than a surmise, that the Earth was once a satellite of Saturn, the latter must have revolved closer to the Sun in order that the Earth should receive heat from it. Saturn exudes little heat, and if the age of Kronos was a golden age, then it is also proper to assume that the conditions on the satellite Earth were not unfavorable for life. The geological record documents extreme climates for the past of the Earth. Times when corals grew in the Arctic, and times when the Earth, partly even on the equator, was fettered by ice. Such climates require definitely abnormal conditions that could be created only by varying positions of our planet as an astronomical body. Therefore, surmises as made in this section are not in conflict with geological and paleoclimatological records. Yet it is not what could have taken place, but what took place, or the historical record that is the proper goal for inquest. In the absence of direct indications, we may only deal with the problem of the Earth as a satellite of Saturn as a hypothetical construction, requiring further elucidation. It is assumed by modern astronomy that the ninth planet, Pluto, was once a satellite of Neptune, which, having collided with Triton, another satellite of the planet, was thrown out of the ring and became an independent planet. The satellite Triton, however, as a consequence of the collision, reversed the direction of its revolution and became a retrograde satellite. Another instance of a postulated conversion of a planetary satellite into an independent planet is discussed by Van Flandern and Harrington in their paper A Dynamical Investigation of the Conjecture that Mercury is an Escaped Satellite of Venus. Thus, the principle of a conversion of a satellite into a planet in its own right is not a phenomenon that is discussed here for the first time. The golden age of Saturn, or Kronos, came to its end when the supreme god of that period, the planet Saturn, was broken up. The age of Kronos was not the earliest age of which man retained some, however, dim memories, but farther into the past, the dimness amounts almost to darkness.
I hope everybody's doing good out there. I'm going to be out in a little bit. Go a little bit more of this. Little Velikovsky on Saturn.
Recently that the merits of the scientific issue do not alter the deplorable treatment Dr. Velikovsky's ideas received from the profession. The prejudging scorn and closing of ranks against the heretic showed typical guild animus. In recent years, however, evidence collected during the geophysical year and by several space probes has tended to verify several of Velikovsky's predictions. For instance, he had said in the face of strong disagreement that because of her recent birth, Venus is extremely hot.
Help him find an answer. The Egyptologist John Wilson wrote that it is an admission of failure that the chief cultural content of Egyptian civilization, its religion, its mythological figures, again and again narrated and alluded to in text and represented in statues and temple reliefs, is not understood. The astral meaning of Egyptian deities was not realized, and the cosmic events their activities represent were not thought of. The prophet Ezekiel in the Babylonian exile had a vision, the likeness of a man, but made of fire and amber, who lifted him by the lock of his hair and brought him to some darkened chamber, where the ancients of the house of Israel, with censers in their hands, were worshipping idols portrayed upon the wall round about. Then the angel of the vision told him, "Thou shalt see greater abominations that they do." And he brought the prophet to the door of the gate of the Lord's house, and behold, there sat woman weeping for Tammuz. Next he showed him also Jews in the inner court of the Lord's house, with their back toward the temple of the Lord, and their faces toward the east, and they worshipped the sun toward the east. What the heck is going on? Or his discovery has taken Tammuz. The flood has taken Tammuz. The raging storm. The flood has taken Tammuz as their chief deity. Eusebius informs us that El, a name used also in the Bible as a name for God, was the name of Saturn. In Persia, Saturn was known as Kevin or Kaivan. The different names for God in the Bible reflect the process of going through the many ages in which one planet superseded another and was again superseded by the next one in the celestial war. El was the name of Saturn. Adonis of the Syrians, the bewailed deity, was also like Osiris, the planet Saturn. But in the period of the contest between the two major planets, Jupiter and Saturn, the appellative of the dual gods became Adonai, which means my lords. Then, with the victory of Jupiter, it came to be applied to him alone. And taking a look at his many references, I've never seen anybody so referenced. Number one, an astrological treatise ascribed to Manetho states that in the beginning, Kronos, the Titan, ruled the entire ether. His star, the far-seeing gods called the Shining One. Ovid, Metamorphosis, when Saturn was consigned to the darkness of Tartarus, the world passed under the
rule of Jove. Tacitus refers to a storm during which Saturn was forcibly expelled by Jupiter and ceased to rule. The error of the pagan religions, Egypt of the pharaohs. The connection of Osiris with water or flood water is frequently stressed both in native Egyptian sources and in reports by classical and early Christian authors. Plutarch wrote that the Nile, the moist principle in power, that the Nile is the efflux of Osiris, and that Osiris is Oceanus. Griffith, a lot of references, 27 references for that article.
Explained the white crown of Egypt and the rest of these things that he showed us, all from mythology, all from thousands of years ago. These things clearly were seen by civilizations that never talked to each other from the far corners of the earth. It all just clicked together like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle in my mind.
A breakthrough for me came when I realized that many different cultures spread around the world use different words, different symbols, different myths to describe precisely the same formations in the sky. The Ouroboros, or celestial serpent biting its tail, for example, occurs on every habitable continent, but it has no ties to the world we now observe. Like all of the archetypes, it is part of an alien sky. A cosmic column rising to the center of the sky, holding aloft the wheel of heaven. And much more than a wheel, because this was the revolving cosmic temple, the city of the gods, the kingdom of heaven, always resting on the cosmic column. Then there's the image of the four rivers or pathways radiating from the center of the sky out to the boundary, the rim of the wheel. The simplest forms lead you invariably to the full story of world mythology. The hero's journey unfolds as the story of the wheel's axle. The mother goddess finds her identity in the star at the summit, the hub and spokes of the wheel.
Well, this video is all jacked up. I didn't realize that. I'm going to have to fix it. It's too bad. I don't know what happened. Well, just have to fix it down the road. See, I'm going to come out there and say hello to everybody. Then we'll get back into it. Just give me 1 second here. To make that screen smaller. And it'll come out. Let's see, where's the live? Right here, I think. Yes, there it is. Hello, everybody. I gotcha. We got John I. Secret Owl. Love that name. Saturn Matrix. Hello. John again, Buried Axe Blade. See, it's happening, brother. Saturn Matrix. Hello. Renegade. And Pally B. And let's see. Buried Axe Blade. St. Pauli girl, you still here? Well, once you get away, you will feel better. Come and say hello if you want. I'm going to play some more stuff. Just wanted to say hello to everybody. I don't want to be anti-sociable. Okay. I think that pretty much covers everybody. 39. Okay. You guys, if you got any requests or anything you'd like to see, just holler and I'll put it up for you. We're going to watch another one right now. Iodine spray in the nose and mouth. COVID gone before it sets in. Really? Interesting. I have iodine, I think. I don't know if I put it in my nose, though. I just put a little in the water, once in a while. Well, we're down to 23, so I better shut up and start playing stuff. All right, I'll get back to it. However, there is an argument in the sense that that argument relates to the human past, as implied by the details of human memory in ancient times, and by human artifacts, in ways that will be obvious. However, the historical argument raises numerous questions of physical fact and physical theory, some of which will not be readily resolved, and several of which may well stand as serious obstacles in the minds of skeptically minded, feet-on-the-ground folks. One obvious and immediate question is whether something as ambiguous as myth could actually qualify as evidence. The historical argument focuses on points of agreement in the memories of widespread races, suggesting levels of coherence, often missed by historians and anthropologists, and raising the possibility that this coherence arises from a core of human experience that has been missed as well. There is an overarching idea in this argument. We've not only misunderstood the past, we've failed to recognize the consistency of ancient memory in pointing to extraordinary events never considered by modern science. Remarkably, every motive of our early ancestors directs our attention to experiences impossible to comprehend in terms of any natural phenomena occurring today. This consistency will be seen even at the most fundamental levels of human memory, and the most deeply rooted themes of the first civilizations. 1. The universal memory of a former age of the gods. 2. The universal memory of an ancestral golden age, inaugurating the age of the gods. 3. The universal memory of a celestial king of the world, whose life inspired the ancestral leap into civilization. 4. Description of the gods as luminaries of immense size and power, wielding weapons of thunder and stone. 5. The universal claim that the ancient world evolved by critical phases or cycles, punctuated by sweeping catastrophe. 6. Global traditions of gods and heroes ruling for a time, then departing amid terrifying spectacles and upheavals. 7. The frequently stated transfiguration of the departed gods into distant stars. 8. The identification of the ruling gods with planets in the first astronomies. 9. The relentless urge of star worshippers to draw pictures of celestial forms never seen in our sky. 10. The desperate yearning to recover the semblance of a lost cosmic order. 11. Their collective efforts to replicate in architecture the towering forms claimed to have existed in primeval times. 12. Their festive recreations through mystery, plays, and symbolic rites of cosmic violence and disorder. 13. Their reputation through ritual sacrifice of the deaths or ordeals of the gods. 14. The brutal and ritualistic wars of expansion, celebrated as a repetition of the cosmic devastation wrought in the wars of the gods. Such motives as these constitute, in fact, the most already verifiable underpinnings of ancient ritual, myth, and symbol. How strange that in our incessant glance backwards, the builders of the first civilizations never remembered anything resembling the natural world in which we live. What is needed in the face of unusual but widely repeated memories is brutal intellectual honesty. How did human consciousness emerge from the womb of nature, converge on the same improbable ideas, contradicting nature? For centuries we've lived under the illusion that our ancestors simply made up explanations of natural phenomena they didn't understand. But that's not the problem. What the myth makers interpreted or explained through stories and symbols and ritual reenactments is an unrecognized world, a world of alien sights and sounds, of celestial forms, of cosmic spectacles and earth-shaking events that do not occur in our world. That is the problem. From an evaluation of the global themes of ancient cultures, we have hypothesized a world order never envisioned by mainstream theory. A world in which planets moved on different courses, appearing huge in the sky. Heaven-spanning celestial forms dominated human imagination to the point of obsession at the time of civilization's birth. Our contention will be that hundreds of ancient themes speak for a unified experience, an experience more specific in context and detail than any of us had ever imagined when we started our research. No universal theme stands alone or in isolation from any of the others. All are connected. All speak for the presence of a coherent memory beneath the surface of seemingly random detail. In offering these summaries, I am not asking or expecting anyone to embrace the extraordinary theory of planetary history involved, only to consider highly interesting evidence. One of the values of this reinterpretation of evidence is the model works, and it explains the subject matter. Hence, whatever you may think of the claimed events, merely discovering the active memory will throw remarkable new light on the ancient structures of human consciousness. In the course of these summaries, questions and challenges will be welcome, and wherever possible, I will try to incorporate these into the narrative as we go along.
End of Part 1. David Talbot. Velikovsky's Comet. Part 2. Venus, Smoking Star. In arguing for the cometary character of Venus, Velikovsky cited Aztec records suggesting that the planet Venus shared the same title given the comet. The early traditions of peoples of Mexico, written down in pre-Columbian days, relate that Venus smoked, the star that smoked. The Estrella que humeva was Cholula, which the Spaniards called Venus. Now I ask, says Alexander Humboldt, what optical illusion could give Venus the appearance of a star throwing out smoke? Sahagan, the 16th century Spanish authority on Mexico, wrote that the Mexicans called a comet a star that smoked. It may thus be concluded that since the Mexicans called Venus a star that smoked, they considered it a comet. In Bob Forrest's mind, the Aztec references could have nothing to do with what may or may not have happened back in the mid-2nd millennium BC, because the references to Venus smoking came from the 16th century AD. In a number of instances, Aztec records say that Earth shook and the star Citlal Venus smoked. To account for the curiosity, Forrest simply accepts the guest of Alexander Humboldt, who suggested that the smoke related to the volcano Orizaba, situated to the east of the city Cholula, and whose glow, when seen in the distance, resembled or was symbolically related to the rising morning star. Forrest was apparently satisfied with the first guess he uncovered. All we have are some 16th century records which say, every so often, that the star smoked. But since the smoking seems frequently to be intertwined with earthquake activity, Humboldt's assumption seems reasonable. With that stated, Forrest moved on, never returning to the issue of the Aztec smoking star. A quite different approach would have been to explore the possibility of a broader Venus-Comet association, to see where the available evidence leads. Guided by this intent, Forrest would have quickly found, for example, that Aztec association of earthquake activity with smoking stars belonged to the general mythology of the comet among the Aztecs. Thus, with respect to the comets portrayed in the Codex Vaticanus and Codex Tellerino-Remensis, the respected authority on Mexican astronomy, Anthony Aveni, writes, "Comets are represented frequently by surviving historical documents, usually by a stellar image on a blue background with emanating streams of smoke. These usually signify that a person of nobility will die. For example, one picture of the death of the ruler Tenochtitlan followed the apparition of a comet. Later, another comet occurs, then an earthquake, all of nature's events being connected in the Aztec cosmic view. As I hope to demonstrate fully in this series of articles, the connectedness of these images derives from a universal substratum of myth: appearance of a comet, death of a great ruler, quaking earth, not in Mexico alone, but in one ancient culture after another. The Skywatchers repeatedly placed these unusual themes in juxtaposition. Despite this crucial fact, no comet observed by science has ever justified the symbolic connection. But Forrest seems unaware that the language employed in astrological texts and omens is drawn from ancient mythical images, following his methodological ground rules. Therefore, no records of portents in the sky recorded in the last 3 millennia would be of any relevance to Velikovsky's argument, even when repeatedly attached explicit cometary images to Venus, with respect to the image of the planet Venus as the smoking star. In the Codex Tellerino-Remensis, Aveni offers his own attempt at an explanation. Perhaps a cometary object appeared near the planet. Of course, Forrest could just as easily have cited this guess, then dropped the whole issue. But is there something more worth investigating here? Throughout the Americas, including Mexico, natives called a comet the star with hair, or long-haired star, or main star, an appellation that fits comfortably with the global language of the comet. In fact, the long-haired star is the single most common phrase for the comet around the world, and our own word for comet comes from the Greek kametes, the long-haired star. Yucatec Maya dictionaries give a gloss for smoke star or main star. But curiously, the Aztecs used this very language for Venus. As noted by Velikovsky, they called the planet Zantemoc, meaning the main star, or long-haired star, and not the Aztecs alone, for one finds among the Maya the same enigmatic association of the planet Venus with long flowing hair. A commonly observed Maya hieroglyph is the Caban curl, a flowing tassel or lock of hair repeatedly attached to acknowledged Venus systems, including the glyph name of Venus itself. To encounter the long flowing locks of Venus, one need only consult available sources. Turn to the Incan language of Venus, for example. I can remember in the first few days of investigating images of Venus, looking through a standard summary of Incan mythology and encountering the name of Venus as Chasca, translated as long-haired star, the precise phrase for the comet in the global lexicon. It was instances such as this that continued to fuel my own interest in learning more. According to William Prescott, Venus was known to the Peruvians by the name of Chasca, or youth with long curling locks. Burr Cartwright Brundage tells us that among the Inca, Venus was the radiant star with flowing hair, the morning star, Chasca, the disheveled one, dispensed stories of freshness and loveliness upon flowers, princesses and virgins below. She was the deity of the rosy cloud rack of morning, and when she shook out her long hair, she scattered the dew upon the earth. The point here is that Forrest's explanation of the Aztec Venus smoking star association fails to acknowledge converging lines of evidence. Aztec comet as smoking star, Aztec Venus as smoking star, Aztec and Mayan long-haired star as comet, Aztec Venus as long-haired star, Mayan Venus with or as flowing lock or tassel, Incan Venus as long-haired star. Hence, the methodological issue is placed in sharp relief. Here is another way of looking at the issue logically. Around the world, there are only a small number of pre-astronomical hieroglyphs for the comet. You could, in fact, count the primary glyphs on the fingers of one hand. Heart, soul of a deceased god king or great leader rising in the sky. Long-haired star, star with flowing locks, mane, tresses, disheveled hair, beard, hairy tail. Torch star, ember, flame, smoke, smoking star, train of fire, spark or train of sparks. Celestial feather, winged star, soul bird, bright feathers, feathered headdress, shining bird's tail, cosmic serpent, dragon, or similar monster. The remaining general hieroglyphs for the comet could be counted on the fingers of your second hand. They include a sword, a bundle of grass or straw, whisk broom, or a spiraled rope, cord, tie, or knot. At what point, then, does a coincidence or seemingly irrational use of language, comet words or glyphs attached to Venus, become an anomaly worth pursuing? Forrest not only sidesteps the implications of parallel cometry, images of Venus in other lands, he ignores the convergence of such images in Mexico. As the methodology, the approach is disastrous because there is much, much more. And next we have Quetzalcoatl. In the popular Aztec myth of Quetzalcoatl, the Venus comet anomaly grows by leaps and bounds, and in this case, the completeness of the commentary motifs leaves no room for ad hoc explanations. Whether remembered by the Aztecs as a former great king and founder of the Golden Age, or a former sun god ruling a primordial epoch, Quetzalcoatl was the cultural hero without equal in the Aztec pantheon. His continuance adorning temple walls and the stucco bases of pyramids, painted on countless frescoes and codices, and engraved on sarcophagi and monoliths strewn across Mexico. The climatic event in the Quetzalcoatl myth is the god's catastrophic death and transformation in an overwhelming disaster, an event endlessly repeated in sacrificial rites, and supplying the cornerstone of Aztec calendar rituals and astronomical symbolism. In a pervasive version of the myth, at the death of Quetzalcoatl, the god's heart and soul, the god's heart or soul rose in the sky as a great spark or ember, trailing smoke and fire. A star whose fiery train the Aztecs portrayed as the streaming tail of the Quetzal bird. Was this flaming star a comet? One notes that the Quiche Maya called the comet Uji Chumal, tail of the star. And the Aztec artists often draw comets as stars with quetzaltails, the bright and luminous plumes of the Quetzal, providing a particularly well-suited hieroglyph for a comet. The symbolism accords well with that of other peoples. The Pawnee gave to the comet the name Paragus Kuka, feathered headdress, an appellation that proves telling. See later discussion of the plumed headdress in our next installment. In Africa, the streaming comet's tail was identified as the feathers of the nightjar, and the natives say of a comet, it is wearing streaming feathers. Astronomer Carl Sagan, or as well would say Carl Sagan, in his review of worldwide comet motifs, notes that comets are called tail stars, and stars with long feathers. Germanic races called a comet the peacock's tail, while in China a comet was seen as both a peacock's tail and a pheasant's tail. Isn't it amazing how it seems like everything that we know comes from Saturn theory?
It's just embarrassingly rich with evidence. That Quetzalcoatl's flaming or plumed heart soul meant a comet-like star is substantiated by converging lines of evidence. Its cometary character, for example, would agree with a general tradition among the Aztecs that comets were the ascending souls of great chiefs. The Quetzalcoatl was the model of the good king. Gives perfect sense to the symbolic motif. The Quetzalcoatl was also the prototype of the Aztec shaman. That is, he was the celestial figure whose biography provided the general myth and symbolism of the shaman. It is thus worth noting that in South American lore, the soul of a shaman was believed to depart in the form of a comet. Noteworthy is the fact that a comet appearing sometime prior to the conquest of the Aztecs by Cortez, was reckoned as a positive sign that Quetzalcoatl would eventually return to Mexico. To suggest that the heart and soul of Quetzalcoatl rose as a comet is simply to place the Aztec symbolism alongside a universal tradition. Cultures around the world proclaim the comet to be the soul of a dying king. Thus, we have listed this significant theme as number 1 in our short list of comet symbols above. See discussion to follow. But there is a problem here. While several variations on the story of Quetzalcoatl's death may have been preserved, one of the central elements is the identification of the heart soul as the planet Venus. Burr Cartwright Brundage gives this summary. The god's heart, like a great spark, flies up to become new and splendid divinity. The morning star. Thus, a narrative source declares, then the heart of Quetzalcoatl rose into the heaven, and according to the elders, was transformed into the morning star, and Quetzalcoatl was called the Lord of Dawn. We shall have more to say about this transformation. The fact at hand is that in their myths and rites, the Aztecs say the separated heart soul of Quetzalcoatl, following a period of darkened sky and cosmic upheaval, rose as the planet Venus. If the story has roots in any celestial occurrence, as explicitly claimed in the myths, the death of Quetzalcoatl must have involved a cosmic disaster of unprecedented scale. For no mythical historical event left a deeper impression on the Aztec thought and culture. Upon this traumatic episode, the Aztecs evolved their collective sense of cyclical time, including a calendar of world ages. The death of Quetzalcoatl, the onset of celestial confusion, and the transformation of his heart-soul into the planet Venus meant nothing less than the end of one world age and the beginning of another. David Talbot. Excellent. Hey, I hope everybody's doing okay and you're staying healthy. Saturn, the ocean, and the flood.
of Saturn I intended already for some 2 decades to write in a volume, Saturn and the Flood, in which, as the title discloses, I would endeavor to identify this planet as the prime cause of the greatest of all catastrophes in human history, the universal flood, or deluge. This part of Worlds in Collision was conceived and drafted together with the parts dealing with Venus and Mars. But the elaboration of details was postponed, and other labors claimed my attention. I am still before work unfinished. I will, however, disclose in a few sentences what is the subject of that part of reconstruction of world history. The age that man later called the age of Kronos, Saturn, was remembered with nostalgia as the age of bliss. It was the earliest age of which man retained some, however dim, memories, but farther into the past, the dimness amounts almost to darkness. Saturn was also a more massive body than it is now, possibly of the volume of Jupiter, whereas now proportion is approximately 7:13. At a date that I would be hard put to task to identify, even with approximately about then 10,000 years ago, Saturn was disturbed by Jupiter and exploded, actually became a nova. The solar system and reaches beyond it were illuminated by the exploded star, and in a matter of a week, the Earth was enveloped in waters of Saturnian origin. Told in such brevity, the story sounds fantastic. I had the choice not to mention these events here at all, or to refer to them and ask indulgence on the part of the readers for having said something unusual, and at the same time ask them to wait for a detailed narrative at some intermediate time. I selected the latter. I have already mentioned that the major planets were in some way connected with earlier cataclysms, one of which was the deluge. When in 1946 the manuscript of Worlds in Collision was first offered to the publishers, Macmillan and Company, New York, it contained the story of the deluge and of the catastrophe that terminated the Old Kingdom in Egypt. But at the suggestion of the reader for the publishing company, the book should have concentrated on one event. We compromised and presented the published volume in 2 series of catastrophes. Those that took place in the 15th century before the present era and were caused by near approaches of Venus, and those which occurred in the 8th century before this era, and were caused by close approaches of Mars. The unused material was left for collaboration in the 2 volumes, Saturn and the Flood and Jupiter of the Thunderbolt. With this hardly even a summary as told on this page, I should possibly dispel any misconception as to what is the design of my manuscript too slow in the making. As to predictions, I could make several, and I offer them cognizant of the fact that a prediction in science needs to be elaborated on the reasons that led to it. I assumed in the first place that the planet Saturn must contain water to the extent that it is a water planet. It is also possible that water that have enveloped the Earth following the explosion of Saturn was at least partly formed by hydrogen combining with oxygen of the terrestrial atmosphere. There are indications that I intend to discuss in my book on the deluge which point toward a sudden drop in oxygen content in the terrestrial atmosphere. But the fact that comets were observed consisting of water, ice, according to their spectral picture, permits the conclusion that water, ready-made, came from the planetary nova. Actually, in years subsequent to my concept of Worlds in Collision, water was identified as present on Saturn. Further, I assume that sodium chloride, or common salt, as an ingredient of the Saturnian atmosphere. Geophysicists have long wondered as to the origin of salt in the ocean. Sodium could have been derived from terrestrial rocks, but they are poor in chlorine. To some extent, chlorine in oceans could have come from volcanic eruptions, but it would require eruptions on an almost unimaginable scale to produce all of the chlorine locked in the salt of the oceans.
The ancient traditions of deluge refer also to the water arriving from space as salty and warm. I have thought also of free chlorine, not combined into salt, on Saturn, but it is possible that vegetable life, at least, is present on Saturn, and free chlorine would interfere with vegetation. The reasons, though not compelling, for this assumption of vegetation on Saturn are also reserved for the detailed discussion. The tradition found in ancient texts refers to innumerable new forms of life in animal and plant kingdom following the flood, which could have been solely a result of multiple mutations. But there exists in ancient lore an ever-reoccurring association of seeds and new plant forms with Saturn, Osiris, Tammuz, and Kronos, all of whom I understand as personifications of the planet Saturn. In recent years, I have chanced to read the view of Joseph Shklovsky, a Russian astrophysicist, that a nova would be a source of cosmic rays even thousands of years after the explosion. Shklovsky and his collaborators offered the suggestion that at some past time the Earth, or the entire solar system, passed through clouds of cosmic rays resulting from a nova star that caused the extinction of various forms of life on Earth, dinosaurs and others. This thought found an echo in me because the same thoughts had been put on paper by me 2 decades earlier, but their assumption that cosmic rays may be discharged by a nova thousands of years after the explosion led me to think that if such is the case, Saturn may still emit cosmic rays, if by now only of low energy. Therefore, when asked at some college gatherings what new prediction I would make, and desirous to tell something that, in case of detection, could not be ascribed to a lucky guess, I volunteered to suggest that there is a good chance that Saturn emits low-energy cosmic rays. This on the assumption that the Russians were right in saying that a nova would still be sending out such radiation after so long a period. Finally, Saturn must emit more heat than it receives from the Sun. Reasons for such conditions of Saturn are at least 2. First, the residual heat of the catastrophe in which Saturn was derailed from its orbit. Second, the radioactivity that resulted from the catastrophe must still be pronounced on Saturn. In addition, Saturn can be regarded as a star and may have some mechanisms that make our Sun burn with intense light. Because the surface clouds of Saturn are cold and the distance of Saturn from the Sun renders the heat from this source very limited, the conclusion was drawn that Saturn must be very cold, frozen to its core. We came to a different conclusion, also concerning the temperature of Saturn below the surface cloud layer. In 1966, Dr. K.I. Kellerman described in Icarus the surprising fact that Saturn, at the wavelength of 21.3 centimeters, shows a temperature of 90 degrees Fahrenheit, which cannot be explained by solar radiation. It will be found of still higher temperature. The rings are formations of less than 10 or 12,000 years old. They must consist largely of water in the form of ice. But since the ancient lore all around the world tells us that it was Jupiter who put these rings around Saturn, they may have some other components too. Since these lines were written, spectroscopic study of the Saturnian rings has revealed that they consist mainly of water in the form of ice. 1966. Sodium chloride and cosmic rays are 2 phenomena still waiting to be investigated. Therefore, I presented to Dr. H. Hess, in his capacity as chairman of the Space Board of National Academy of Science, a memorandum dated September 11, 1963. Subsequently submitted also to Dr. Homer Newell, in his capacity as director of NASA. I included these lines concerning Saturn. Saturn tests should be devised for detection of low-energy cosmic rays emanating from Saturn, especially during the weeks before and after a conjunction of Earth-Jupiter-Saturn. Chlorine should be looked for in the Saturnian spectrum of absorption. His reference here is, interestingly, for certain reasons, G. Kuiper assumed in recent years that Saturn originally was of a mass equal to that of Jupiter. Sky and Telescope, March 1959. It must have been at the very beginning of my occupation with the problems later developed in my books and in not yet published manuscripts that I came upon the question of the origin of salts in the sea and oceans. The common salt is a substantial ingredient of oceanic content, or, said differently, the water of the oceans and the seas contains a substantial solution of NaC1, or sodium chloride, even though our blood and tissues abound in sodium chloride. Man and animals are not adapted to drink salty water, and life on land could develop only thanks to the evaporation of the water from the surface of the seas and the oceans, or to distillation. The evaporating water is free from its salts, falling as rain or snow or dew. It feeds underground sources and also glaciers, and through them the brooks and the rivers and lakes is delivered to our use, usually through concrete tubes and metal pipes. Of the salts of the sea, sodium chloride is by far the most abundant. The provenance of it is, however, a riddle. It was, and still is, assumed that the salts in the ocean originated mainly through the importation from land, having been dissolved from rocks by flowing rivulets and rivers, themselves fed by underground sources, and the same process working on the rocks of the seabed. Terrestrial formations are rich in sodium, and in eons of time, it is assumed, the sodium washed out of the rocks supplied its content to the oceans. The seas evaporate, and the concentration of these salts grows, but the rocks are by far not so rich in chlorine, and hence the problem. From where did chlorine come to contribute its abundance to oceanic water? There is chlorine in source water, but usually not in significant amounts. The proportion of salts in the rivers is very different from their population in the seas. River water has many carbonates, 80% of the salts, fewer sulfates, 13%, and still fewer chlorides, 7%. Seawater has many chlorides, 89%, fewer sulfides, 10%, and only a few carbonates, 0.2%. The comparison of these figures makes it clear that rivers cannot be made responsible for most of the salts of the seas. Therefore, it is also obvious that there is no proper way of calculating the age of the Earth. By comparing the amount of salts in the seas with the annual discharge by the rivers, the most that can be done in this respect is to calculate the rich amount of carbonates in the rivers and in relation to the relatively poor concentration to these salts in the seas. But then there will be no explanation for the rich amount of chlorides in the seas in comparison with their poor concentration in the rivers. Part of the salts could be traced to the washing of lands and the floor of the seas. Chlorine is also known to be discharged by volcanoes, but to account for the chlorine locked in the seas, volcanic eruptions, whether on land or under the surface of the seas, needed to have taken place on an unimaginable scale. Actually, it was figured out on an impossible scale. Thus, it was acknowledged that the provenance of chlorine salts in the seas is a problem unsolved. Paleontological research makes it rather apparent that marine animals, in some early age, were more closely related to freshwater fauna. In other words, the salinity of the oceans increased markedly at some age in the past. The most obvious and permanent effect of a deluge of extraterrestrial origin on the Earth would be the increase in its water volume and of the place occupied by the seas. Presently, 4/5 of the Earth are covered with water. A stupendous addition of water to the Earth should have decreased, not increased, its salinity, if the water came down in a pure state. But if the Earth was showered by torrents of hydrogen and water, some other ingredients of the Saturnian atmosphere,
could also have swept across the Earth's orbit. In the Buddhist book on the world cycles, the Visuddhimagga, where the catastrophes that terminated the world ages are described, it is said, "But when a world cycle perishes by water, there arises a cycle-destroying great cloud of salt water. At first it rains with a very fine rain, which gradually increases to great torrents, which fill 100,000 times 10 million worlds. And then the mountain peaks of the earth become flooded with saltish water and hidden from view, and the water is buoyed up on all sides by the wind and rises upward from the earth until it engulfs the heavens. Volcanoes, which were active during the cataclysm of the deluge and during other cosmic upheavals, vomited sulfur, chlorine, and carbonates, and contributed to the composition of the salts of the oceans. Carbonates fell on Earth in large quantities. In some of the upheavals, certainly in one which took place in the middle of the second millennium before the present era, at the very end of the Middle Kingdom in Egypt, an upheaval described in detail in Worlds in Collision. But a major portion of the chlorine in which the oceans are so rich must have come from an extraterrestrial source. My explanation for the origin of a large portion of the salts of the seas suggests that Saturn is rich not only in water, but also in chlorine, either in the form of sodium chloride or in some other combination, or even atomic-free. The last solution of atomic-free chlorine appeared chemically and biologically somewhat difficult to contemplate, because chlorine is a very active element, seeking ties with other elements. Biologically, because it would be damaging to any plant life. Yet there are other indications which point to the possibility of plant life on Saturn. As references, Visuddhimagga, the knowledge that the water of the oceans came from the most part from Saturn, and that the waters were salty, was combined by the Greeks into a metaphor which has the sea being the tier of Kronos. This tradition originated with the Pythagorean school and may derive ultimately from Egypt. Plutarch. According to what the Pythagoreans say, the sea is the tier of Kronos. Clement of Alexandria. This the Pythagoreans believe, comparing the sea to a tier of Kronos. The same is found in a fragment of Aristotle in the edition of V. Rose, 1886, Life of Pythagoras. Star of the Sun. Saturn is not a conspicuous planet in the sky. Were it not for its sluggish movement, an unaided eye would hardly distinguish it from the surrounding stars. In many ancient sources, Saturn is called Sun. The usual name for Saturn in Chaldean astronomy, Alab-Shamas or Alap-Shamas, meaning star of the sun. Diodorus of Sicily reported that the Chaldeans called Kronos Saturn by the name Helios, or the sun, and he explained that this was because Saturn was the most conspicuous of the planets. Hyginus also wrote that Saturn was called Sol. 3. In the Babylonian astronomical text, the word Shamash, sun, was used to designate Saturn. We learn from the notes written by the astrologers that the word sun, we must understand the star of the sun, i.e. Saturn. Ninib was the Babylonian name for Saturn. Ninib, in various places, is said to shine like the sun. He was known as Utgalu, the great son of storms. The Greeks used to call Saturn Phanon, the shining one. If Saturn was always as inconspicuous as it is at present, what could have caused the races of antiquity, as if by common consent, to give to Saturn the appellative Sun, or the Shining One? ? The astrologers certainly must have found it increasingly contrary to reason to associate the star that gives us light and life with one of the palest
and slowest of the planets. The folk etymology of the Hebrews explained the name Kema as meaning about 100 Kemia stars. The Bhagavad Gita contains the following description of a deity. If the radiance of 1,000 suns were to burst at once into the sky, that would be like the splendor of the Mighty One, the Shatterer of worlds. All that we have considered up to now indicates that Saturn once exploded in a nova-like burst of light. The date of this event I would be hard put to specify, even approximately, but possibly it took place 10,000 years ago. The solar system and reaches beyond it were illuminated by the exploding star. In a matter of a week, the Earth was enveloped in waters of Saturnian origin. And there's his references. Everything he puts down is referenced, well, by all mainstream scientists. It's up so much. Snow White and the Frozen Dwarfs. Snow White and the Frozen Dwarfs. On August 24, 2006, the International Astronomical Union adopted fixed definitions for various objects in the solar system. Snow White, otherwise known as 2007 OR10, is a dwarf planet about 13 billion kilometers from the Sun. Its orbit, canted by almost 31 degrees to the plane of the ecliptic, is so large that it was closest to the Sun in 1856 and will not reach its furthest point until 2130, taking more than 550 years to revolve. Snow White joins many other icy worlds so far from the Sun that it would be hard to pick out that luminary from the star field. It is in similar orbit with its sister dwarf, Eris. 2003 UB313. Within a region occupied by so-called trans-Neptunian objects, TNO, or Kuiper belt objects, KBO. Astronomers Kenneth Edgeworth and Gerald Kuiper proposed a Kuiper belt theory in 1951. In 1992, the as-yet unnamed 1992 QB1 was discovered, confirming the idea that a group of frigid objects beyond Neptune was in orbit around the Sun. Dwarf planets are also part of the TNO designation, trans-Neptunian, although they are in a subclass by themselves. In 2006, a controversial vote was cast at a meeting of astronomers in Prague that provided a way to classify various celestial bodies. 4 relevant resolutions were proposed. Resolution 5A, definition of a planet. Resolution 5B, definition of a classical planet. Resolution 6A, definition of a Pluto-class objects. 6B, definition of Plutonian objects. According to the vote, the planet, in quotation, is a celestial body that orbits the Sun, has a nearly round shape, and has cleared its orbit of extraneous debris. Another classification was added to the terms used by astronomers: dwarf planet. A dwarf planet is essentially something that looks like a planet but is not a planet. Pluto is now considered a dwarf planet, as is the asteroid Ceres, along with an aforementioned Eris and Snow White, Haumea, Makemake, Sedna, Quasar, and Orcus are also likely to be dwarf planets. Pluto's moon, Charon, would also fit if it were not a moon. There are dozens more that await further investigation. Pluto is an intriguing planet, isn't it? It's odd. Immanuel Kant's theory that the solar system was born from a dusty cloud of gas or nebula floating in space is known as the nebular hypothesis. As Kant suggested, the cloud contracted because gravity drew the cloud's particles together into clumps. As they grew, the clumps became more attractive, finally accumulating into a mass. The gravitational force became so strong that it compressed the mass into a hot ball, rotating with the cloud's original angular momentum. It gathered more and more matter until nuclear fusion reaction ignited it, giving birth to the Sun, a structure called an accretion disk, circling its equatorial plane. The accretion disk is said to have extended beyond the orbit of Neptune. According to scientists, eddies of matter formed in the spinning ring of dust and gas. Those eddies grew larger, slowly sucking in more and more particles until hundreds of millions of impacts from nebular condensates gradually formed the planets. The Kuiper Belt, as well as the theoretical Oort cloud, were supposed to be holding areas for the remaining material that did not condense into planets, or dwarf planets. In a previous picture of the day, another class of solar system object called centaurs were discussed. It was noted that they are what could be called cometary asteroids, and come in several colors: reddish-brown, blue, green, and brownish-yellow. As suggested by this writer, the centaur objects could be colored because they were ejected by the gas giant planets, the colors corresponding to the colors of their parents. An interesting characteristic of the various dwarf planets is that they, too, are colorful. Snow White, contrary to its name, is reddish in color, like its sister Haumea. Pluto itself is brownish-yellow, while Eris is green. In a plasma cosmogony hypothesis, the stars are formed when cosmic Birkeland currents twist around one another, creating Z-pinch regions that compress the plasma into a solid. Laboratory experiments have shown that such compression zones are the most likely candidates for star formation and not collapsing nebulae. When stars are born, they are probably under extreme electrical stress. In that case, they will split into two or more daughter stars, thereby equalizing their electrical potential. The fission process is repeated in further electrical disturbances by flaring red dwarfs and gas giant planets ejecting rocky and icy planets, moons, comets, asteroids, and meteorites. Planetary systems may also be acquired over time by electrical capture of independent interstellar bodies such as dim brown dwarf stars. That seems the best explanation for our fruit salad of a solar system. Wall Thornhill. When New Horizons arrives at Pluto in July 2015, Electric Universe theorists expect a nebular hypothesis to be falsified again, as it has in the past. 99% of the universe is plasma, so the conclusions derived from the hypothesis are not connected with real observations. Stephen Smith. I have read that before. Long farewell to the Big Bang model of cosmology. Summary. The article deals with the background to the failure of physics in the 20th century, and why it is so important to work out a new physical worldview. I have to stop. That was rather dated. I'd like to say a very special thank you to Angela Tyson. You were my lone PayPal donator for the month of October. Bless your heart. Well, okay, Grouch too. But that was it. No, I take that back, Andrew. Oh, man. The cosmos is to be understood as an open system, not as an inflating ball. This knowledge has a direct bearing on the understanding of the sun, and thus also on its reproduction in the laboratory. It can possibly provide us with a clean energy source for the future with which we can achieve the energy transition from fossil carbon age to the hydrogen age. Cosmology is the study of the world, of the origin, development, and structure of the cosmos. If we allow the cosmos to develop, we cannot know anything about the origin. The current structure, however, can be seen, but inferring the initial state from the current structure only works with time-independent processes, such as a Markov process. Since a time can be reversed there, this is not possible with a development process. Every engineer knows that you cannot deduce from the final state to the beginning. Just as little as you can still recognize the horse-drawn carriage in a modern automobile. The assumption of an initial state belongs to the realm of belief in a religion. Besides, what time is valid in the cosmos? Time is relative, so you have no absolute start. Religions are static, but our knowledge grows dynamically with our failure and our successes in mastering nature. In short, the development of technology, the technical replication of elements of nature, is the ultimate proof of our understanding of how they work. How can we then succeed in reconciling belief in religion with science? Our faith ends where knowledge begins. Fewer and fewer functions of nature are expected of gods today, and more functions are recognized, and thus become the responsibility of mankind. 100 years ago, Georges Lemaitre, a Belgian priest,
Lemaitre.
Georges Lemaitre, a Belgian priest, was inspired by the belief that this reconciliation might succeed because at the beginning of the 20th century, there were two currents in the Catholic Church. One wanted a liberalization of religion, the other wanted to reconstruct old power structures, as it is expressed in the encyclical of Pope Pius X. Of course, the authority to interpret the sky was one of the most important goals. It was not about the unreserved exploration of the cosmos. Rather, it was about the integration of scientific discoveries into the thought structure of Christian doctrine of creation, whereby the scientists consciously found support and recognition that best corresponded to this idea. They were added in 1936 by Pope Pius XI through a newly founded Pontifical Academy of Sciences. On the other hand, at the beginning of the 20th century, electromagnetism was so well researched that it could be transferred to technical applications. However, the application was still based on a large-scale charge separation by means of mechanical power, largely by burning fossil fuels. At the same time, two worldviews competed: the electromagnetic of James Clerk Maxwell and the mechanical gravitational worldview of Isaac Newton. While the electromagnetic worldview of the 19th century brought us from the energy industry to microelectronics and into an unprecedented level of prosperity, the advances on the basis of Newton's gravity seem rather modest. The question of why the moon and the space probes are not on the Earth falling back but swinging into orbit cannot be explained mechanically satisfactorily. Even though the worldview that was developed at the Solvay conferences from 1911 is still adhered to today. Many discoveries have been made since the beginning of space travel history that do not fit this picture. We have to ask why this is so. Figure 1, Einstein and the Pontifical Academy. You have to know that philosophy at the turn of the 20th century was shaped by subjective idealism. The mysticism of the virgin birth was promoted by Lemaitre and replaced by a mathematical mysticism. Paul Dirac was one of the most prominent exponents of this mystification, who, although an avid atheist, was a member of the newly founded Pontifical Academy of Sciences from the beginning until his death. Mathematics took the place of religious belief. Remember, in the ancient times, the only place that scientists were allowed to let their minds soar was in mathematics, that the church did not feel threatened. Mathematics took the place of religious belief, and with its symmetry as an expression of beauty, it is more important to have beauty in your equations than agreement with the experiment, Paul Dirac once formulated his credo in Scientific American. Dirac even spoke in the context of God, whom he considered being a highly brilliant mathematician. Wolfgang Pauli once put it, "Our friend Dirac has a religion, and its motto is 'There is no God,' and Dirac is his prophet." He became the creator of a number of physical phantoms, the existence of which in some cases has even been allegedly proven, such as the spin from the Dirac equation and the neutrino in the radioactive decay of the neutron. So, it came about that relativity theory and quantum mechanics emerged as intellectual fantasy products and were recognized as established theories. In a conversation with Einstein, Heisenberg admitted that one does not yet know how the mathematical formulation of quantum mechanics relates to the basis of which is the Lorentz transformation of Maxwell's equations, whose sole purpose for Einstein was to symmetrize these equations. This symmetrization is a physically completely nonsensical operation, since it destroys the character of the equations, namely to describe the propagation of electromagnetic waves. As a second stroke of genius, Albert Einstein invented the curvature of space through gravity because he could not explain how celestial bodies were kept in their orbit. Einstein himself must have taken it as a joke because he confessed to his friend Paul Ehrenfest, "I've already done something wrong in the theory of gravity, which puts me at risk of being interned in a madhouse." Although anyone who knows something about physics and geometry knows that curvatures can only be observed on surfaces, and that light rays are influenced in their direction by diffraction due to optical effects. Whole generations of physicists seem to have no longer learned the difference between a surface and a space. Physically, a surface presents itself as a phase boundary between two different states of matter. Furthermore, they seem to have forgotten that time is never independent of the path. This is why there cannot be a four-dimensional world, but there can be a process in which there are sequences of states. Only surfaces can be curved. Space-time is space and time, not a four-dimensional space. Time, in contrast, is a number of motion cycles that are counted and are synchronized with the movement of the Earth around its axis. Unlike the path on which it is based, it has no direction. Where one begins to count the cycles is left to the discretion of the observer. Consequently, the time is relative. Einstein once remarked that time is what clocks indicate, with which he expressed the relativity of time. Relativity means that a relation, i.e., a relationship, is established between the observer and the observed phenomenon, no more and no less. Therefore, appearances can be perceived differently from different points of view, although they themselves are unchanged. So if you perceive an object in the distance as smaller, it is not due to physics, but to the optics of your perception. The Lorentz transformation does the same with Maxwell's equations, which is why this figure shows time and distance distortions. As Einstein said, you can fool of yourself with mathematics. Physics have learned to solve equations, but apparently they have not been taught what they mean. Since Dirac and Heisenberg, visual perception wasn't trained when I was studying physics half a century ago. So physicists tried using mathematics to construct an illusory world for which they were looking for evidence in reality. However, new phantoms have to be invented, because this leads to contradictions again and again. Then further evidence was sought in reality without being bothered by the fact that this evidence had already been used up for other phenomena. We have recently started calling something like this alternative facts. Mathematics is a language intended to describe real things and appearances. Alternative facts can also be invented with a language. One of the most spectacular examples of this alternative facts is the black hole, which repeatedly stimulates people's fantasies. Einstein's equation of general relativity has a pole, which is interpreted as a point of maximum gravity, and should be strong, that it would not even let light escape. The belief was triggered because they could not explain why galaxies do not obey Newton's equation of gravitation, but must contain much larger forces in order to explain their rotational speeds at the edges. To resolve this contradiction, the black hole, dark matter, and dark energy were invented. But these terms do not say anything more than something invisible and mysterious exists that cannot be described with the known laws of physics. Really, they can't be disproved either, so therefore they really shouldn't be allowed. According to Newton's particle theory, light would consist of photons be trapped in a black hole and would be deflected in strong gravitational fields. We know light deflection is an optical phenomenon resulting from wave diffraction or refraction at phase boundaries between an optically thinner and an optically denser medium. This has nothing to do with gravity, but with the optical density of the medium in the vicinity of plasma balls. In terms of radiation, black is an absorption range of around 400 nanometers to 780 nanometers. Why should this area be preferred by gravity? Or should this phenomenon be extended to the entire electromagnetic spectrum? That would mean that in the vicinity of a black hole, not even thermal radiation should occur. In other words, since we can only learn something about the existence of cosmic objects through electromagnetic radiation, their existence would not be verifiable, because forces, if they can be measured, only reveal direction and strength, but not the nature of their origin. And I would think that electromagnetism is really the only thing they have to measure. What else is there? The decades-long dispute between Leonard Susskind and Stephen Hawking turned on the question of whether information can be retained in a black hole was also spectacular. This question is pretty academic and becomes easier to understand if you remember that light contains information about its light source in the form of a spectrum. If this information is not retained, it means that the light source is no longer lit, i.e., does not emit any electromagnetic radiation. But as long as charges cross a force field, they absorb or emit radiation and thus information. That would mean, however, that the entropy would decrease since the order would increase with the decrease in the movement of the atoms. This would contradict the second law of thermodynamics in a closed system. The dispute is recorded in the book The Black Hole War, My Battle with Stephen Hawking to Make the World Safe for Quantum Mechanics. This dispute continued for many years and ended in 2014 with Hawking's admission that there were no black holes. Notwithstanding this, the 2020 Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded for the discovery that the formation of black holes is a robust prediction of general relativity. You rub your eyes in amazement. Has the black hole war and its end
humans are afraid of
the
the
Nobel
truth.
Committee? Or was it celebrated astrophysics star Hawking posthumously disqualified as a dabbler? No, the general theory of relativity has become the foundation of the Catholic worldview. And what would happen if this foundation would crumble? How much research capacity would then be free for other tasks? The cosmos is an open system. Pope Francis himself undermined this very foundation when he wrote in paragraph 79 of his 2015 encyclical, In this universe, made up of open systems that communicate with one another, we can discover innumerable forms of relationship and participation. However, this statement would contradict physicists who understand the universe and black holes as closed systems, because the theory never spoke of an exit. According to Reverend Planetary, the universe expands. Now we know that information has something to do with entropy, and according to Ilja, this applies to the change entropy in the overall open system.
ds system equals ds-inp, ds out plus d-sint equals d-sex plus d-sint.
For a black hole, ds out equals 0 because by definition it does not release any entropy in the form of radiation. This means that the total entropy change of a black hole is
ds system greater than 0.
ds system greater than 0 would always be positive. The black hole could not cool down at all, since the total entropy would not decrease at any time. This would prevent the mass from being able to contract and would be the prerequisite for gravity to grow in a small area. Thermodynamics disturbs the beauty of the symmetry of the equations, which is why relativists and quantum mechanics want nothing to do with it. For the above equation, Proto-quasars was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1977. Now, chemistry, like physics, belongs to the natural sciences. It is assumed that the knowledge of this neighboring discipline should have been incorporated into physics over the past 4 decades. But what is, then, in the center of a galaxy, if there is no black hole? Huge electrical currents flow in the center of a galaxy that, in turn, generate huge magnetic fields. These then cause charge separation. This is why we see plasma currents emerging from the center of certain galaxies, which is typical for a plasmoid. Unlike a black hole, a plasmoid is an open system. After the violation of Maxwell's equations by the symmetry, fans among physicists who say there are no electrical currents in the cosmos, black spots are rather retouched in the images of galaxies at the points of highest luminance to mark a suspected black hole. Recently, a photo montage of recordings of large radio telescopes of galaxy nuclei has been in the press. If you know that gas molecules radiate in the radio range and have learned that molecules break down through ionization, it soon becomes clear that molecules are not preserved in the hot glowing center of a galaxy. So, the center in the radio range, which is glaring in visible light, comparatively has to emit less radiation. This is how this photo comes out, which depicts a situation that is interpreted completely differently from what it tells the expert. There are other examples in the recent history of physics where research results are supposed to support the untenable theories around the Big Bang model of cosmology. These include the alleged proof of gravitational waves from the collision of black holes or neutron stars, or the proof of the existence of the so rare God particle Higgs boson, that the mass should pass to the other particles. Obviously, such people have forgotten that mass is nothing more than an unaccountable amount of particles. The term mass, therefore, becomes superfluous in the area of individual elementary particles. It is worthwhile to take a closer look in science as well as in other areas where there is no control. You always have to expect to be cheated, especially since experiments are so expensive today that independent control is no longer possible in a timely manner. Unfortunately, general knowledge in the natural sciences, and especially in physics, has steadily declined over the past few decades, which is a fundamental disadvantage for a nation that, like ours, Germany, is dependent on education because it has no natural resources and which, under the influence of climate change, has to transform its economy towards clean energy generation. This requires an understanding of how the cosmos, and especially the sun, work as an open system. An understanding here means the construction of a fusion generator that delivers so much entropy from the fusion of atomic nuclei that a gas turbine can be operated with it. From thermodynamic point of view, the tokamak principle is obviously based on a wrong approach, namely that of a closed system in which high temperatures can be reached, but not a higher order as required by fusion. But that is a topic for another essay. And I believe this gentleman's name is
Matthias Hafner.
Matthias Hafner. I just don't understand how it is that we're ever going to expand or advance in science when they teach the wrong thing to the people at school. It just confounds me. It's dangerous. You know what I mean? You got, like, look at the Chinese loading up and putting nuclear missiles on their ships and stuff, man. It's crazy. I mean, you can't, it's just not even an option. It'll just destroy the planet. Like Velikovsky warned. We still face it today. Amazing. I'm curious to see what the rest of this is. And why there's no music. I might have had to take it out. Sometimes I just don't replace it. Feel free to join me in the Great Hall.
conversation in the chat tonight. Really good conversation. Yeah, we're talking about all kinds of things. In the chat, it's kind of funny because we all start off, we're all watching the video, what you're saying, and we're still watching it in between. But we get in these little side things, conversations that are really interesting too. I mean, it's. I could hear that. I could hear that. Yeah, the song that's on right now is pretty cool. Here. Exactly. What is this about? Well, I have mine shut off because I can't have both on. So okay.
Notice the twin dots on the two sides of these crudely crafted stick figures. One instance alone is just a curiosity. But widespread patterns must have an explanation. And other details only accent the irrationality. Recently, an answer to these mysteries came from outside traditional archaeology, from plasma science and laboratory experiments with electric discharge. Plasma scientist Anthony Peratt of Los Alamos Laboratories has shown that these stick forms recorded electrical events in the sky. Something like the northern lights we see today, but 1,000 times more energetic. And he matches the rock art forms precisely to the configurations taken by electric discharge in the laboratory. The rock art images are explained as sheets of intense electric current in the evolution of a plasma discharge. The central column you see in this stylized representation is the axis of the discharge. Wrapped around the axis is a torus or donut-like tubular sheet of charged particles. The observer sees through the transparent formation, champagne glass above, squashed bell shape below, so the plasma density is greatest at the limbs. Drawn in 2 dimensions, the formation matches the stick man carved globally on stone by the thousands. The 2 dots under the stick man's arms are the exceedingly bright, high-energy radiation called synchrotron radiation, emitted from the center of the torus.
Physical snakes. This is political, or it is religious, theocratic, theological propaganda. He's saying, Christianity has arrived, I am in town, there's a new gig, there's a new game in town, and you can just forget about these serpents and the previous races that were here. Their time is over, and the new sun religion, the new solar paradigm has arrived. That is political, or it is religious, theocratic, theological propaganda. He's saying, Christianity has arrived, I am in town, there's a new gig, there's a new game in town, and you can just forget about these serpents and the previous races that were here. Their time is over, and the new sun religion, the new solar paradigm has arrived. That's what it represents. And it implies, of course, that the people of the prehistoric times, before Christianity, not only revered the symbol of the serpent, but were actually known as the serpents. And we'll come to more explanation of why that is a little bit later. Now, even though there's a great wealth coming out of the ancient mythologies of all countries, scientists disagree and speculate that there was no ancient civilizations of any merit in ancient times. But the ancient legends also speak about their own demise, just like the Tuatha De Danann, saying that they came from islands that were destroyed in a great war of the gods and a great calamity of nature. So we have in many of the mythologies of the world this reference to destruction and cataclysm and upheaval. The most famous story, of course, is Noah, the famous patriarch, being literally told by God of a coming flood, and that the whole earth was going to be in tribulation, and that he should build a vessel so that the chosen ones could be saved. But that's not the only area in the scriptures where we read of cataclysm. Yes, there's the deluge, but then we also have the story of the 10 plagues of Egypt. We have the story of the destruction in Sodom and Gomorrah, and we have the story of the walls of Jericho being blasted to pieces, and many other areas through the whole book of Job. There's tumult and cataclysm and stories of great upheaval. In Genesis 6, God is saying, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them. Now, from a scientific point of view, what are we told? We're told, yes, we have an ice age. This ice age happened in what we know as the Pleistocene epoch, and before the ice age, there was nothing. Men walked around in skins, and Neanderthal man, hunter-gatherers. No such concept as Atlantis or Lemuria or any other advanced civilization could possibly have existed. So what is the tenets of the official theory? Well, the high priests of geology were of Charles Lyell. He was the exponent of the theory of uniformity. That simply means that through the geological record, nature, evolution, all of these things are incrementally slow, very, very slow movements of development over vast expanses of time. Louis Agassiz, he was the exponent of the glacial theory, exponent of the ice ages, and particularly Professor James Geekie, geology professor at Edinburgh University, a major champion of the ice age theory. And believe me, that's all it is, a theory, as we're about to see. Now, the ice ages are meant to have taken place, geologically speaking, in what is known as the Pleistocene epoch. This is the epoch lasting 2 million years that is housing what we know as the ice age. But Professor James Geekie says, if there is anything more fantastic than Geekie's extravagant theory, it is that it has been lapped up by his successors and by intelligent men who, by logic alone, should be able to denounce it. Yet it is today a dogma. This is Commons Beaumont, one of the most suppressed scholars of all time, talking about Geekie's findings. He says it's unsustainable, simply a dogma. Communist Beaumont goes on to say, the flood, to the world generally a vague and nebulous tradition, really conceals the most appalling visitation, and its ravages in the British Isles and Scandinavian lands may be retraced to more considerable extent by the effects of what geologists term the drift age. It was no mere ice drift, it was a sudden and terribly swift and violent. So Beaumont was one of the great catastrophists. Along with Immanuel Velikovsky, he was a person who decried and did not believe in or subscribe to the uniformitarian philosophy. He understood that we had been visited by tremendously swift cataclysms of the past. And he spent his life trying to refute what Geekie and the uniformitarianists were advancing. And in the fine book, When the Earth Nearly Died, by Allen and Dallaire, they say, it is an astonishing that such an unscientific explanation ever came to be formulated, yet in a short time both it and the concept of immense, thick ice sheets descending from a hypothetical northern mountain system was enthusiastically embraced as virtually established fact. They go on to write, the evidence is perfectly unambiguous, along with the removal of an ice age like that which is hitherto commonly envisaged. The evidence suggests that there is something seriously amiss with the last phases of standard geological chronology. Now, these unsustainable theories of ice ages and drift ages has been refuted in the 90s by several authors, not only Allen and Dallaire, but by Michael Cremo in his monumental work Forbidden Archaeology, and more specifically by the Observer magazine scientific writer Robert Milton, who wrote a fine book called Shattering the Myths of Darwin. Now, Clifford Wilson, in his book, The Chariots Still Crash, he says, some dates obtained by other radiometric methods are seriously astray, such as the age of millions of years being attributed to volcanic rocks in Hawaii, which are known to be less than 200 years old. This is reported in the Journal of Geophysical Research. It is known that these lava rocks were actually formed in 1800 and 1801 in Hualai in Hawaii. The potassium-argon dating methods was utilized, and a formation age of 160 million to 3 billion years were given for this rock formation, which was known to be just over 170 years old. This is not an isolated report. Rock samples from 12 volcanoes in Russia and 10 samples from other places around the world, all known to be of recent age, that is, formed within the last 200 years, when dated by the uranium, thorium, lead method, gave ages varying from millions to billions of years. So here's your science for you. But luckily, a lot of these scientific findings are now being seriously refuted, and we need to know about this. Clifford Wilson goes on to say, there is increasing evidence to suggest that those figures of millions of years, which we were given in our childhood, must be put to one side. And indeed they must. But what would happen if they are? What happens if we suddenly start to question these Royal Academy and Royal Society dates and figures and scholarship? Well, then the truth of what might be behind that Pleistocene epoch, I mean, if you concertine the whole 2 million year Pleistocene epoch out of existence, suddenly you have no ice ages, no substantial ice ages, and therefore no great wall between our time and the past. Evidence thus converges from numerous directions to support the conclusion that on the testimony of radiocarbon and other dating techniques, immense physical and climatic changes occurred on Earth some 11,000 years or so ago, when an ice age that probably never existed came to an end, and the apparently uniformitarian regime was abruptly terminated. There you are. That's Allen and Delaire saying that something happened so much more recently, and it had very little to do with an ice age. Thus, if many of today's highest mountains were much lower when the alleged ice age was reputedly at its zenith, then how did so much ice, if it actually existed, manage to accumulate? Indeed, we can take a step further and ask whether the ice sheets, so beloved of the glacialists, ever existed at all. Now, these two geologists have discovered that the mountains that are quite high today all over the world were not as high 11,000 years ago. Well, of course, that goes to the heart of the glacialists' theory. You have to have very high peaks in order to have the cold for the ice sheets to be created. But if they actually were being told, then there goes your ice theory right out the window. They go on to say, the time allegedly occupied by the glacial and interglacial episodes of conventional Pleistocene chronology was actually non-existent. Now, how come we have not heard worldwide debate about this book or of Robert Milton's Shattering Myths of Darwinism?
All right, that wasn't bad. We're going to end part 1. We're going to get into part 2, which is going to be coming up. I'm just going to stop this for a second. Hold on. I remember making that, but I don't remember that big gap. I'm going to have to fix that. I don't know where that came from. Snow White, I'll have to remember that. All right, well, you know what? I'm just kind of curious. While we're still into cosmology, let's just play a little bit of this one too, because I'm curious. And then we'll move on, and we'll get into Lemuria next on part B. We'll start a new one. Hold on, Polly girl. Just watch maybe 15 or 20 minutes of this. Before we go any further, I just want it to be known that reading mainstream articles causes me mental anguish,
acute scotoma, severe anxiety, narcolepsy, nightmares, mental trauma, PSPD, emotional distress, hurt feelings, moral hazard, pain and suffering, psychic energy, emotional harm, intellectual disability, academic failure, acute WTF disorder, psychological trauma, and greater damage to the radial cavity.
Messier 87 has swallowed an entire galaxy in the last billion years. Now, observations with ESO's Very Large Telescope have revealed that the giant elliptical galaxy Messier 87 has swallowed an entire medium-sized galaxy over the past billion years. Have found evidence of excessive light coming from the remains of the totally disrupted victim. For the first time, a team of astronomers has been able to track the motions of 300 glowing planetary nebulae to find clear evidence of this event, and also found evidence of excessive light coming from the remains of the totally disrupted victim. I'm trying to picture a galaxy eating another galaxy. It would just become part of that galaxy. But yeah, who knows what it would look like. Astronomers expect that galaxies grow by swallowing smaller galaxies, but the evidence is usually not easy to see. Just as the remains of the water thrown from a glass into a pond will quickly merge with the pond water, the stars, and the infalling galaxy merge in with the very similar stars of the bigger galaxy, leaving no trace. But now a team of astronomers led by PhD student Elisa Longobardi at the Max Planck Institute in Garching, Germany, has applied a clever observational trick to clearly show that the nearby giant elliptical galaxy Messier 87 merged with a smaller spiral galaxy in the last billion years. This result shows directly that large luminous structures in the universe are still growing in a substantial way. Galaxies are not finished yet, says Elisa. Look up Halton Arp. The large sector of the Messier 87's outer halo now appears twice as bright as it would if the collision had not taken place. Messier 87 is at the center of the Virgo cluster of galaxies. And this is what we think it looks like. But this is what it really looks like. It is a vast ball of stars with a total mass more than 1,000,000 times that of the Sun, lying about 50 million light years away. Rather than to try to look at all the stars in Messier 87, there are literally billions, and they are too faint and numerous to be studied individually. The team looked at a planetary nebulae, the glowing shells around aging stars, because these objects shine very brightly in a specific hue of aquamarine. They can be distinguished from the surrounding stars. Careful observation of the light from the nebulae using a powerful spectrograph can also reveal their motions. Just as the water from a glass is not visible once thrown into the pond, but many have caused ripples, and other disturbances can be seen if there are particles of mud in the water. The motions of the planetary nebulae, measured using the flames spectrograph on the Very Large Telescope, provide clues to the past merger. We are witnessing a single, recent accretion event where a medium-sized galaxy fell through the center of Messier 87. As a consequence of the enormous gravitational tidal forces, its stars are now scattered over a region that is 100 times larger than the original galaxy, as Ortwin Gerhard, head of the dynamics group at the Max Planck Institute, an extragalactic astronomer and co-author of the new study. The team also looked very carefully at the light distribution in the outer parts of Messier 87, found evidence of extra light coming from the stars in the galaxy that had been pulled in and disrupted. These observations also have shown that the disrupted galaxy has added younger, bluer stars to Messier 87, was probably a star-forming spiral galaxy before its merger. It is very exciting to be able to identify stars that have been scattered around hundreds of thousands of light years in the halo of this galaxy. Can you imagine being a planet going around a star in the Eaton galaxy, going around it, but still be able to see from their velocities that they belong to a common structure? The green planetary nebulae are the needles in the haystack of the golden stars, but these rare needles hold the clues to what happened to the stars, concludes co-author Magda, Garching, Germany. All right. Black heart, holes in space and time. We should remember that there was once a discipline called natural philosophy. Unfortunately, this discipline seems to not exist today. It has been renamed science, but science of today is in danger of losing much of the natural philosophy aspect. Hans Elfing. Consensus astronomers believe that gamma rays, X-rays, and radio waves are created by gravity and acceleration in space. Dusty clouds of hydrogen gas are supposed to reach temperatures in the millions of Kelvin causing gas and dust to glow brightly and emit radiation. In that view, powerful radiation sources are those that achieve the greatest gravitational force. Cygnus A is one of the first radio sources that revealed jets and lobes accelerating out of its nucleus. They are thought to result from material falling into a central black hole, where it is torn apart. Subatomic debris is then propelled out of the galactic core by some means not understood in consensus circles. It is suggested that spinning magnetic fields surround black holes, but the theory cannot be tested. Among the many difficulties faced by mainstream astrophysics is how magnetic fields can align and compress particle emissions into gas that maintain coherency. Radio jets from some galaxies reach out for over 1 million light years before they disperse into vast clouds of radio-emitting particles, larger than their galactic sources. Recently, the astronomical community announced their first image of a black hole. Researchers from the Max Planck Institute for Radio Astronomy in Bonn, Germany, and the Institute of Radio Astronomy, IRAM, using the Event Horizon Telescope, captured what they believe is an image of a black hole. What is that visual evidence? The press release states that a ring-like structure with a dark central region, the black hole's shadow. This ring appears in multiple separate observations using different imaging methods, making the scientists involved confident that they have indeed captured the shadow of a black hole. The important factor missing in their observation is that the magnetic fields mentioned in the press release are electromagnetic and not simply magnetic. The only way to generate a magnetic field is with a flow of electric charge, or electricity. As written in previous pictures of the day, radio bright celestial objects are not created in gravity fields, no matter how powerful. Laboratory experiments most easily produce them by accelerating charged particles through an electric field, rather than gravity. An electromagnetic entity called a plasmoid is responsible for jets, lobes, and other objects in space. Many people need to learn about this plasmoid. As far as black holes are concerned, there are no experiments that show evidence for matter collapse to near infinite density. It is Bennett pinches, Z-pinches, in plasma state material that form plasmoids. When the electric flux inside double layers within galactic circuits gets too high, there is a sudden short circuit that draws energy from the surrounding space. The energy could be concentrated from hundreds of cubic light years and then discharged in a burst of cosmic lightning, generating X-rays or flares of ultraviolet light. Instead of a black hole, a plasmoid in M87's heart is ramping up charged particles, so electrons spiral in the electromagnetic fields and give off X-rays and radio emissions. The idea that electricity flows through the universe is resisted by today's consensus, so its influence and attributes are unseen. It is true that some physicists discuss magnetism, and some even describe what they believe to be electric currents in galactic jets. It is not a widely accepted idea, though. It has long been said that seeing is believing. However, it should not be surprising that believing is seeing appears to be more apt when there is no inner experience, such as a theory. Outer realities remain invisible, such is the case with cosmic electric fields and the flow of electric charge through the universe. Stephen Smith. Hat tip to William Thompson. Indeed.
The sapphire technology was designed and built to replicate the atmosphere of the Sun in a laboratory on Earth, and to test the electric sun model. These are the factors we control. These are some of the things the Sapphire Lab is now capable of. These are some of our recent discoveries. In our tests and experiments, we have found no disparities with the electric sun model. In fact, all the evidence to date indicates that electricity is the primal force in the universe.
Medium, one from the world of cells. Same thing, interstellar medium, world of cells. This is my favorite. Two of those are from the world of biology, two are views of something going on in our galaxy. So this is not an accident that they look the same, and it's not an artifact of our instruments. The reason these two worlds look so similar is because in many ways they are similar. We live in a living universe. The cosmology that we grew up with is dead. And I don't mean dead as in over with. I mean it only talks about dead things. Stars are supposedly dead. Galaxies are supposedly dead. The whole universe is supposedly dead. And only you and I are alive. Only you and I. The profoundness of this absurdity needs to be re-examined. Astrophysics will be stuck until it can acknowledge that the objects it studies are alive, just like you and me, and our little cells.
Double layers in laboratory and cosmic plasmas. The Helicon Double Layer Thruster. HDLT, credit Australian National University Research, School of Physical Sciences and Engineering. Electric double layers are like waterfalls that energize charged particles falling through them. We have to learn again that science without contact with experiments is an enterprise which is likely to go completely astray into imaginary conjecture. Hans Elfing. A double layer forms in plasma when electric charge flows through it. Double layers are found in the plasma environment of Earth, as well as around the stars, creating phenomena like aurorae and electromagnetic radiation from pulsars, thermal emissions from hot filaments in light bulbs, LED plasma, lead plasma pioneer Irving Langmuir, to contemplate that the behavior of charged particles moving through various gases He was the first to coin the term plasma when referring to such ionized gas, since charged regions in gas tend to isolate themselves from the environment, as well as act in ways not governed by mechanical theories. He thought they appeared similar to the organic plasma component of cells. So he used biology-based terminology. I don't think it's way off base either. There might even be something to that, mimicking cells with the living cell galaxy theory. Scientists from the National University Research School of Physical Sciences and Engineering in Canberra.
I think there are all kinds of different consciousness throughout the universe,
finding that they were accelerating eons to supersonic velocities. The double layers are self-generated, so the effect has been incorporated into an efficient spacecraft thrust mechanism. As mentioned, a double layer is an electric charge separation region that forms in plasma. It consists of oppositely charged parallel layers, resulting in a voltage drop and electric field across the layer, which accelerates the plasma's electrons and positive ions in opposite directions. Since moving electric charges generate electricity, there is an electric current present. If there are sufficiently large potential drops in layer separation, electrons might accelerate to relativistic velocities, producing synchrotron radiation. Nobel Prize winner Hans Elfane described a double layer as a plasma formation by which a plasma, in the physical meaning of this word, protects itself from the environment, and it's analogous to a cell wall by which plasma, in the biological meaning of this word, protects itself from the environment.
The negative electricity holds the cell wall up.
Has some kind of self-protection mechanism. Electric forces can accelerate charged particles with energies of 10 to the power of 20 electron volts or more. Since electricity requires a circuit for charge to flow, and an electric current forms a magnetic field. That field tends to constrict the current. As pointed out in previous Picture of the Day articles, that constricted channel is known as a Bennett pinch or Z-pinch. The pinched filaments of electric current remain coherent over large distances. Laboratory experiments with particle accelerators confirm the observation. Plasma's behavior is driven by conditions in those circuits. Fluctuations can form double layers with large potential voltages between them. The electric force in double layers can be much stronger than those from gravitational or mechanical forces. Double layers separate plasma into cells and filaments that can have different temperatures or densities. At times, a double layer might interrupt charge flow in the circuit, causing a catastrophic rise in voltage across it. The powerful energy release of the expanding double layer is sometimes observed in power transmission switchyards when a circuit breaker is opened incorrectly. I think we've all seen those. Hans Elfane identified just such an occurrence when he was contracted by the Swedish power company to investigate some serious accidents that had occurred. A few of the mercury arc rectifiers used in the power transmission circuits had exploded for no apparent reason. Elfane identified the cause as unstable double layers within the plasma flow. He wrote, "In Sweden, the water power is located in the north and the industry in the south. The transfer of power between these regions over a distance of about 1,000 kilometers was first done with AC, when it was realized that DC transmission would be cheaper. Mercury rectifiers were developed. It turned out that such a system normally worked well, but it happened now and then that rectifiers in Norp produced enormous overvoltages so that fat electrical sparks filled the rectifying station and did considerable harm. An arc rectifier must have a very low pressure of mercury vapor in order to stand the high back voltages during half of the AC cycle. On the other hand, it must be able to carry large currents during the other half cycle. It turned out that these two requirements were conflicting. Because of very low pressure, the plasma could not carry enough current. If the current density is too high, an exploding double layer may be formed. This means that in the plasma, a region of high vacuum is produced. The plasma refuses to carry any current at all. At the sudden interruption of the 1,000 kilometer inductance, produces enormous overvoltages which may be destructive. There are also double layers in space that emit radio wave over a broad band of frequencies. They can sort galactic material into regions of like composition and condense it. They can accelerate charged particles to cosmic ray energies. Double layers in space can explode for the same reason as Alphane's rectifiers, releasing more energy than is locally present. This effect can be seen in stellar flares or so-called nova outbursts. Let's just hope the sun never does that. Since plasma is composed of charged particles, their movement constitutes an electric current which generates a magnetic field. Electrons spiral in the resulting magnetic field, creating synchrotron radiation that can shine in all high-energy frequencies, including extreme ultraviolet, X-rays, and gamma rays. According to Alphane and others, electric power flows along the spiral arms of a galactic circuit, where it is concentrated and stored in a central plasmoid within the galactic bulge. When the current density reaches a critical threshold, the plasmoid discharges along the galaxy's spin axis as an energetic jet of plasma. The phenomenon has been replicated in the laboratory with a plasma focus device. Cosmic plasmas and their activity can be replicated in the laboratory, allowing insights into the large-scale structures that populate the universe. Since gravitational forces cannot be examined in the laboratory, or laboratory, if you choose, consensus opinions about the gravity-only model of celestial objects suffer from a moribund condition. Hopefully, a fresh perspective will
I think it's reasonable to start about 100 years ago. And about 100 years ago, almost everybody in astronomy, without question, assumed that the whole of the universe was what you could see in the Milky Way. Nobody felt that the universe was any bigger than the stars that you see in the sky, associated with our own local Milky Way. And that was the situation certainly around 1905, times like that. They're well-known people who propounded these ideas. 10 years later, Einstein first proposed his general theory of relativity. Now, when Einstein proposed this, it's a theory of gravity, which means that it's a theory which should represent the whole of the universe, because it's gravitational forces that are controlling the universe. Well, Einstein made this theory around 1915, and he immediately wanted to try and use this theory to explain the universe as it then was, the so-called Milky Way system. But of course, the idea of this was that it was a static system. That is, it wasn't contracting or expanding, it was a static system. And Einstein found that his equations did not allow for a static universe unless he inserted a certain constant in the mathematics, which became known as the cosmological constant. But what happened in the early 1920s was that a very clever Russian called Friedman in 1922 found solutions to Einstein's equations which allow the universe to either expand or contract. Now that was done in the Soviet Union soon after the revolution, and nobody in the West knew about this, I think. But in 1927, a Belgian priest, the Abbé Lemaitre, as he later became, also discovered these solutions. And he went to England, and his work was publicized in Cambridge and elsewhere, and the famous English astronomer Sir Arthur Eddington and others got to know about this, and they immediately began to say, how can this apply to the current universe? Well, in the same period, in 1929, Hubble made what I still believe was the most important discovery in extragalactic astronomy. Nobody in the West knew about this.
Next to Halton Arps.
But in 1927, a Belgian priest, the Abbé Lemaitre, as he later became, also discovered these solutions. And he went to England, and his work was publicized in Cambridge and elsewhere, and the famous English astronomer Sir Arthur Eddington and others got to know about this, and they immediately began to say, how can this apply to the current universe? Well, in the same period, in 1929, Hubble made what I still believe was the most important discovery in extragalactic astronomy in the last century, or the last century but one. He showed that if you look at the spiral nebulae, the faint spiral nebulae, the shifts in their spectra are proportional to their apparent brightnesses. And this led very soon to the idea that this fitted very well with the expanding universe, and that indeed this is the kind of universe we lived in, that what we were looking at are galaxies, Milky Ways, further and further away from us, and the further away from us, the larger the redshifts, and if that's interpreted in the way that most people would interpret it, this means that they are moving away faster and faster. So this was the original idea. By the 1930s, the front page of the New York Times said we live in an expanding universe.
When Hubble made his great discovery, it was for galaxies like our own Milky Way galaxy, and they all followed the same rule, that the fainter they are, the larger their redshift. In other words, the faster they are moving away from us. This is known as the Hubble law, and directly led to the expanding universe theories. But in the 1960s, there was a new discovery, the quasi-stellar objects, often referred to as quasars. They appear as star-like points on the sky, frequently blue in color, and they have very, very large redshifts, implying that they are at huge distances from the Earth, at the very boundaries of the observable universe. Some astronomers soon found that a vast number of these strange new objects populated the regions around spiral galaxies, and were not only observable with radio telescopes, but were optical and X-ray sources as well. There were two properties of the quasars that were difficult for astronomers to understand using the expanding universe theory. The first was that if one plotted their apparent brightness against their redshifts, as one does for galaxies, one gets an unexpected scatter on the diagram, instead of the smooth curve made by the same plot done for galaxies. This seems to indicate that the quasars do not follow the Hubble law as do most other objects, and that there is no direct indication that they are actually at their proposed redshift distances. In fact, it is argued that if Hubble had first been given the plots for quasars, he and other astronomers would never have concluded that the universe was expanding. The second property was that quasars are very small, compact objects, sometimes only a light year across. So if quasars are really at their extreme redshift distances, they must then be the brightest and most energetic objects known to astronomers. So energetic, in fact, that untestable, almost metaphysical mechanisms must be applied to explain the phenomena. On the other hand, when placed at their observed distances, that is, in the neighborhood of nearby galaxies, their brightness and energies become normal, and no special mechanisms need to be evoked. This problem has led many astronomers to abandon the idea that all redshifts are due to their speed of recession away from the Earth. And if this is true, then there is no need for an expanding universe, and the Big Bang never happened. The questions arise. Is there a connection between certain types of galaxies and the quasar? Are quasars ejected from galaxies, and in fact proto-galaxies themselves? Is there some other astrophysical process which can explain the redshift discrepancies? One of the world's most controversial experts on the structure and morphology of quasars, Halton Arp, has for 35 years proposed just such an idea. For the heresy of opposing orthodox interpretations of the redshift problem, Arp has had to pay a heavy price, the same price paid by many a scientist with new and innovative ideas. Dr. Arp was forced to resign from his permanent position at the Carnegie Institute of Washington Observatories after the Caltech head of the Telescope Allocation Committee threatened him by saying, unless he changed his line of research, they would take away his telescope time. Due to this fact and his ongoing struggle against the established paradigms, Arp is often referred to as the modern Galileo.
I remember when I sent the paper into, the first paper into Astrophysical Journal on the nature of companion galaxies, and I had a lot of them on the ends of spiral arms, so I was sure that they were connected, and I showed that they were systematically redshifted. I sent that in with naive, great expectations that people would be terribly interested and impressed on this. And the editor of the Astrophysical Journal at that time was Subrahmanyan Chandrasekhar, who had a fantastic reputation as a master theoretician and also quite an incomprehensible theoretician, and a tremendously powerful figure in the field, and editor of the Astrophysical Journal, which is probably the most powerful position in the field. And he chose not to, in his wisdom and judicial fairness, chose not to send it to a referee, but he just wrote across the paper, "This exceeds my imagination," and he sent it back to the director of my institute, Horace Babcock, with the obvious implication, you've got to do something about this staff member of yours who's doing these very bad things. And so Horace called me down in the office one day after this, and I walked in his office, into the director's office, and I saw this paper lying in front of him with Chandrasekhar's scroll across it. And Horace looked at me and said, well, he said, this is just too much, and you're going to have to start looking for another job. And so all I could say to him was, well, if you send me that in writing, please send me in writing. And I was waiting in great trepidation for weeks and months to get something in writing, and I finally never did, so I realized that he decided to give me another chance, so to speak. So that was fairly early in the game, and then some years went by, and there was the competition for time, particularly on the 200-inch telescope, was getting more and more heated, and people were saying, well, we can't continue to give time to this obviously incorrect and embarrassing research that Arp does. So finally they sent a letter to me from the allocation committee, including a number of the younger members of my institute, saying that unless I changed my line of research, that they would have to take away my telescope time. At that point, I considered the situation very carefully, and I figured that the the evidence, although a lot more evidence could be gathered and has since been gathered since then, the important thing was not the evidence, because if it was true, it would come out someday. The important thing was the principle of scientific investigation, whether scientists could follow new lines of investigation and follow up on evidence which apparently contradicted the current theorems and the current paradigms. And I also felt that regardless of what happened to me personally, that this was the important issue, and that I had no choice but to resign on the point of this issue, so that if it developed, which I thought it would, that my line of investigation was correct, that people then in the future would say, okay, this was the wrong thing to do, and in the future we're going to have to see that this kind of thing doesn't happen again.
The observers come in now with the belief that we live in a Big Bang universe, and therefore all of their ways of understanding things are tailored to that. And they don't come in with the possibility that our alternative, or any other for that matter, is right, and really do it in an open-minded way.
Problem with graduate education. I think graduate education is not teaching students to think.
They were initially at high redshift, and the redshift decayed as time went on, and therefore we were looking at a physics that was operating in the universe in which matter was born with low mass and with very high redshift, and as it matured and evolved into our present form, that we were seeing the birth and evolution of galaxies in the universe.
If proto-quasars, ejected from the nucleus of active galaxies, themselves evolve into new, younger galaxies, astrophysicists must find experimentally and observationally the mechanisms which describe this phenomena. One model explains that the proto-quasars are ejected, trapped in the galaxy's extreme magnetic field, aligned along the spiral arms, thus explaining the torn, disturbed features often observed in the galactic medium, and the frequent appearance of high redshift companion galaxies attached by filaments to a lower redshift parent galaxy. The other and most frequently observed alignment is when quasars appear to have been directly ejected out of the galaxy's active nucleus along its line of least resistance, creating a field of systematically high to low redshift quasars, or younger to older evolved proto-galaxies. This is exemplified in innumerable systems like the one around the galaxy quasar field of NGC 3516. If one disregards the proposed redshift distance to these objects, observation clearly points to ejection as a likely explanation for their close vicinity to the central galaxies around which they are found. These results, though preliminary, are promising developments which may lead the way to new and exciting insights in cosmology.
One of the best and earliest of the really controversial things was a Seafoot galaxy known as NGC 4319, which Chip Arp discovered that it has a protrusion coming out in the south direction from it, one of its spiral arms, and ending up on another galaxy known as Markarian, and people have tried to explain it away in all kinds of ways, and then tried to take false pictures to show that it's not there. But I've seen the good pictures, which were the first really good pictures were taken by Jack Sulentic.
NGC 4319 was part of some work that I did in the early 80s when I was a young astronomer, a young faculty member, and people were coming up to me and saying, oh, I've written a paper to show that what Chip Arp has done is wrong. There were at least 3 famous papers right around 79, 80, 81 And it took about 5 minutes to look at these papers to see that they were flawed. And one of them was a paper that claimed to show no connection between NGC 4319 and the quasar, Markarian 205. So at that time, I had the opportunity to work at JPL using the new image processing facilities that had been developed for the Voyager program, in fact. And it took 1 hour's effort to show that there was some kind of a luminous feature between those two objects. I don't know what it is, but there's no question that there is a luminous feature, and it cannot be dismissed in the ways that it was dismissed in the early 80s.
Suddenly there appeared press releases from Space Telescope Science Institute, which was the research arm of NASA's Hubble Space Telescope, and this press release said that they were not connected, and it gave a Hubble Space Telescope picture. It was not very deep, and you could just see two objects and no connection between them. And in this press release, then they said that this proved that there was no contradiction with the current expanding universe paradigm.
That these monsters spent their lives on dry land. They became the impossible dinosaurs because nobody could work out how their physical structures I had to abandon ship for a minute and take care of couple things, and looks like I got back just in time. How's everybody doing? Was a little bit longer than I thought, but I wanted to get all that in because it was all pertaining to the same thing. So we got Secret Owl, Alchemy 88, good to see you. Secret Owl's looking for a Thunderbolt. You're gonna get a golden Thunderbolt if you stay the whole distance. You've been here ever since the beginning. Saturn Matrix 2. Elron, Prime, good to see you. Let's see, Valerie was here. Oh, man, I'm sorry I missed you, Valerie. Valerie's a very nice girl. I know her. She's a friend of my son. And she used to be a waitress at one of the bars we used to play at. Polly 1123 was here. It's good to see everybody. It's time for us to change this. We're going to close this one out, and the next one is going to be on Lemuria. We'll get a little mystical. I like to do that too. So everybody, just look for the new one coming up, 51. Oh, that's a great number. I hate to leave on that, but it's 4 hours already. Hello, Alchemy. And, I don't want to mix subjects. So we're going to switch gears here. I'm going to shut this down and then start a new one right away, so look for it, okay? How you doing, Prime? Good to see you, mate. Good eye, mate. Where's my buddy Grouch? Is he not here? I would expect him to be here. Paul, are you still in the chat? All right, folks, I will be right back.